Chapter 201. White clouds floated on the mountainside in the distance. The dark green field stretched as far as the eye could see. The precision irrigation equipment of the Federation's automated farm was spraying morning dew under the sun. From time to time a faint buzzing sound could be heard. It was in perfect harmony with the chirping of the insects in the forest beside the road. The capital's special district's traffic was very developed. After driving for 40 minutes along the highway, the solemn buildings of the capital were no longer in sight. The smell of power was also gone. As far as the eye could see, there was only verdant greenery and the wonderful smell of juice from the broken stems. Just beside the Federation's automated farm, high walls and iron fences separated a large area. From the road, one could only see a 5-story building in the courtyard. Other than that, there were no other eye-catching buildings. The window of the black car rolled down. Sulu showed the electronic recommendation letter to the guard. With a beep, the door slowly opened. He narrowed his eyes and looked at everything around the car. He was a little surprised. The Federation's largest security company, Whitewater Security Company, was located in the capital's special district. It looked quiet with a sense of decline. It didn't look like a company famous for the Federation's high-end weapons. Instead, it looked like a forgotten farm amusement park. Where there was metal, there would be fruit shells. The Shell Motor Company was a giant company in the Federation. The number of people who directly or indirectly served it exceeded 1 million. This company had countless branches, and its business scope involved all aspects of the Federation's social life. Whitewater Security Company was one of them. Because of the disturbance in the research institute, Sulu was sent to Whitewater Security Company. Before he came, he did some research and found out that this was the Federation's largest security company. Although the Shell Motor Company didn't pay much attention to them in terms of strength, they were the strongest among the Federation's 3 largest security companies. The Federation had a lot of military operations in the universe. Because of the diplomatic pressure from the Empire and the 100 Mu Triangle, it was inconvenient to mobilize the military. Plus, there were some conflicts with firepower on resource planets, or some secret operations that could not see the light of day. Most of the time, it was the 3 major security companies of the Federation that carried out these operations in place of the federal military. And Whitewater, which was directly under the Shell Motor Company, because of the thick federal military color of its shell, became the main operator. Of course, these were all things that couldn't be seen in the news, but those who knew the inside story knew very well that the Whitewater Security Company was actually a group of mercenaries disguised as mercenaries, or rather, the Federation's thugs disguised as mercenaries. In addition to some security work within the Federation, most of the company's business scope was actually in the borderlands of the Federation. There was even a rumor that after the firefight between District S2 and the anti-government forces had stopped, the company was also secretly involved in the small armed forces that carried out the surprise attack. Therefore, Sulu was a little surprised when he saw the base that looked like a simple factory. From the outside, the headquarters of the Whitewater Security Company didn't have a trace of military color. After the personnel department reported in, an affairs officer wearing glasses coldly led Sulu to an office at the back of the building and said to him, "This is your office. In a moment, your secretary will come over to give you the details of your work." What happened in the capital special district didn't spread to the Whitewater Security Company, so the people in the headquarters didn't care at all about the arrival of a young second lieutenant. The affairs officer in the personnel department didn't think that Sulu had any background. In his opinion, being sent to the Whitewater Security Company from the Husk Institute meant that he was definitely a loser in the struggle, and a complete failure. However, the Shell Motor Company's first-order department after all, while the Whitewater Security Company was only a third-order department. Sulu had such a resume, so even though he was banished here, he was still assigned the position of technical supervisor and even a secretary. The affairs officer looked at Sulu expressionlessly and asked, "Is there anything else?" The combat personnel of the Whitewater Company were extremely outstanding, and the base was also very well equipped. Many of the combat personnel were even military personnel themselves. These combat personnel on the front lines were well paid and had a promising future. However, the affairs officers and technical supervisors were all pitiful people who were pushed out of the core area of the Shell Motor Company. The affairs officer was the same, but he didn't have the slightest bit of sympathy for Sulu, who was also a loser. No, thank you, Sulu said, turning on the computer screen. Sulu squinted his eyes and looked at the organization structure of the Whitewater Company. For a moment he fell into silence. The Whitewater Company was established 24 constitutional years ago. The current CEO, Garay, was once the commander of the Federation's Special Mecha Forces before he retired. According to rumors, after his term at the Whitewater Company ended, he might directly return to the Ministry of Defense to be the commander of the Operations Department. The structure of this company was very strange. Important people like the CEO and the head of training, as well as the basic combat personnel, all had extremely bright futures. However, people like Suli's current role, technical supervisors and affairs officers, seemed to be forever stuck in the shadow of the Federation. They carried out those dark missions for the righteous Federation government, but they didn't receive any military medals or rewards. However, this had nothing to do with Sulu. He was assigned to the Whitewater Company because of the consequences of his actions in the experiment. In order to appease the displeasure of the board of directors and the unrest in the research institute, even the Tai family could only do this much. Sulu never thought that he would go to a border resource planet to suppress the natives on behalf of the government, nor did he think about disguising himself as a militant and going to District S2 to destroy the anti-government military's resource base. He only needed to sit down in the technical supervisor position of this department, repair some mechanical equipment required by combat personnel, and live out this period of time peacefully. Until the Federation's new generation of MX-type mecha was successfully developed, it looked like he would have to spend his life in this company. Thinking of this, Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked around his office. This was the first time in his life that he had an independent office that would not be disturbed by others. The problem was that although this office was very luxurious, other than a computer and some furniture, there was nothing else. The company has 5 subsidiaries under its jurisdiction: the training center, the shooting range, the weapons experiment department, the space guard, and the security consultant. Clients include the Ministry of Defense, the Police General Administration, and the HTD Bureau. We also accept requests from outside the star system, as long as these requests do not violate the Federation's laws. Our 7th team's main business is in the security consultant area. Sulu lowered his head and listened to the secretary's report. To be honest, when he first heard that there was a secretary, a strange feeling arose in the young man's heart. He secretly prayed that the company would not give him a middle-aged woman with a lifeless aura. When this secretary named Bai Yulan walked into the office and began to introduce the Whitewater Company's situation according to the script, Sulu could not help but sigh softly. The name female secretary was a bit vulgar, but the wonderful thing was that this secretary was not a middle-aged woman, nor was she a young and attractive girl who had just graduated. Because the person who came in was not a female secretary at all, the secretary Bai Yulan was 1.73 meters tall. His facial features were gentle and soft, and his eyes were calm. He stood quietly in front of Sulu like a girl, but the problem was that he was not a woman, so this kind of aura was a bit strange. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at him. From this strange aura he caught a hint of danger. Sulu's ability to recognize people was very strong. He had the keen intuition of an animal. If it were not for the fact that Secretary Bai stood in front of him like a serene young girl, and did not show any hostility, perhaps he would have felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Only people who had killed many people and did not take human life seriously would show this kind of aura. In the past years, Sulu had seen many powerful people, such as Captain Tian, Madman Li, and Brother Zheng, who was beside the 7th young master of the Li family. The secretary in front of him, Bai Yulan, was different from these people. He restrained himself very well, but he always gave people the feeling that he would go crazy in the next moment. The calm and gentle expression on his face would turn into a bone-chilling coldness in an instant. When Sulu was looking at Secretary Bai's eyes were looking at the booklet in his hand. His heart was calm, so his appearance was calm. Although he did not welcome a young second lieutenant sent by the Research Institute to be the technical supervisor of his group, he did not show the slightest expression. He just calmly and indifferently did what he was supposed to do. After being in the military for many years, Bai Yulan was used to seeing death and blood. He did not see this young and ordinary guy in front of him. "What is the work of our group?" Sulu noticed that Secretary Bai's hands were as white as jade and very delicate. Reporting to the technical supervisor, Team 7 does not have any work arrangements this year, Secretary Bai replied politely. Sulu was not used to the title of technical supervisor. Whitewater Company was a subsidiary of the Shell Motor Company. In addition to carrying out those dangerous missions, the most important work was to cooperate with the Federation to experiment with new weapons and equipment. Therefore, within Whitewater Company, the technical supervisor had more power than other security companies. Sulu was the technical supervisor of Team 7, which was why this delegate Bai Yulan was his secretary. Since Team 7's main work was in the field of security consulting, they definitely would not be stationed on a border planet. However, they also did not have the opportunity to come into contact with those few failed MX prototype mecha. A faint feeling of disappointment grew in his heart. Half of year 67 of the constitutional calendar had passed, and Team 7 of Whitewater Company's security consulting department still had not carried out any missions. Sulu felt that it was a little strange. Although the Federation had always maintained good law and order, the rich and powerful had always attached great importance to their own security. With Whitewater Company's reputation in the industry, it should not have been possible for Team 7 to not have any business for an entire year. He looked at Bai Yulan's delicate hands and was somewhat lost in thought. Chapter 202. There were many apartment buildings on the 13th Avenue of the capital's special district. Outside the gate of the high-end apartments, which were shrouded in orange lights, taxis stopped and left. Ladies holding flowers walked in and out of the apartments with lonely expressions. Along the streets, middle-aged men could be seen hurriedly walking with newspapers rolled up in their hands, and old women could be seen staggering as they were led by several big dogs. Wild cats, attracted by the smell of hot vegetable oil bread, were crouching under the iron railings next to the apartments, looking pitifully at each other. This was a city full of the smell of power. The rental of the apartments on the 13th Avenue was extremely high. Most of the residents were government workers in the Federation, or executives of large companies. Only these people would not care about the large amount of tax they had to pay to the HTD Bureau every year to raise pets. In recent years, the high-class prostitutes of the Federation had also begun to move into the 13th Avenue. They knew that the security and environment here, as well as the big shots living here, could provide them with a steady stream of customers. Sulu walked up from the underground parking lot at the end of the street. Feeling that the weather was a little hot, he took off his jacket and wrapped it around his arm. Although he still retained his military position as a civilian second lieutenant, he was already in the Whitewater Company, so he did not need to wear a military uniform every day. He silently walked past the high-class apartment buildings that towered into the clouds. Suddenly he laughed. He thought of last year outside the nightclub in Linhai. Sure, Qinghai mocked Zhou for using perfume that only high-class prostitutes of the 13 Great Paths would use. He didn't expect that the days would not pass quickly. The man and woman, who seemed to be irreconcilable, would have a child because of one night of madness. Looking at the number plate of the high-class apartment building, Sulu confirmed that it was number 187. He walked in, gave the security guard a temporary pass number, and was politely led to the elevator door by the gray-haired butler. The elevator door opened, and a waiter led Sulu to the corridor on the right. The more they walked, the more silent Sulu became. He realized that the top 3 floors of the high-class apartment building had been completely opened up. The side of the corridor was quiet, and the dome above his head was made of transparent tempered glass. He did not know how much such a renovation would have cost. At the end of the corridor was a small room. The green wallpaper filled the entire space, and there was an oil painting on the wall. It was a dazzling golden sunflower. Opposite the oil painting was a glass window, and the windowsill was densely packed with green plants. The flowers between the plants were blooming. All that entered his eyes were flowers, and at a glance there were flowers everywhere. However, these bright and colorful flowers did not make it difficult for people to feel annoyed. Instead, they only felt that the colors were bright and it made people feel refreshed. Just like in the bedroom in the ivy garden, Li Xiaotong was always surrounded by flowers. It seemed that only in this way could the 7th young master of the Li family convince himself that he was just a playboy. The first thing Sulu saw was not Li Xiaotong, who stood like a plum blossom, but the silent middle-aged bodyguard behind Li Xiaotong, Brother Zeng. Brother Zeng was standing behind Li Xiaotong's chair with his hands behind his back. He looked like a gun tightly bound with countless layers of coarse cloth. The cold light was restrained, and the murderous intent was not released. Li Xiaotong saw Sulu come in, smiled, stood up and reached out his hand. I am very surprised that you can come, but I am also very happy. Sulu clumsily reached out and shook hands with him. He had seen a lot of big shots and visited a lot of high-class places over the years. His heart had been shocked by the picturesque landscape of Macho's Back Mountain, so he shouldn't have been shocked by Li Xiaotong's three-story building. However, he was still a nobody in his bones. Besides, coming here today was the first time that he was talking to the big shots of the Federation as an equal. Therefore, he was not used to it. During the night visit to the Ivy Garden, Sulu did not cut off Li Xiaotong's head with the knife in his hand. On one hand, he knew that Park Ji-ho was not sent by the seventh young master of the Li family. On the other hand, the silent Brother Zeng was too strong. After that night's conversation, Li Xiaotong helped him hide the news of Park Ji-ho's death for a while. Although he did not do much, he still helped Sulu. This morning on the road in the suburbs, Sulu received a call from this person. He had been thinking for a whole day before he decided to come to the banquet. But he did not understand why the other party wanted to meet him. Logically speaking, everyone thought that he had lost the fight for the laboratory data, so he should not have any value that could be used. Sulu believed in the Tai family's confidentiality. Even the young master of the Li family could not know that he still had the key data. As for what Li Xiaotong said on the phone about following him, Sulu could not even laugh. The richest family in the 7 families of the Federation was the Li family. According to Zhou Yu, although Li Xiaotong was ranked 7th in this generation, he was actually the second-in-line successor. Why would such a person follow him? This was too ridiculous to be a joke. In fact, after Sulu walked into the room, the 7th young master of the Li family seemed to have forgotten what he said on the phone. He just gently chatted with him and introduced the oil painting of flowers and trees in the room. Lin Banshan once said that the old men in the Federation are already rotten. They like to do things in the company of tea, in the heat of hot springs, and ponder with each other for 10 or 20 years before revealing their true thoughts. The dishes were already on the table. The aroma was not very strong, but the taste seemed to be very good. Maybe they did not want the aroma of the dishes to mix with the fragrance of the flowers in the room? These young masters were always so picky when it came to details. Sulu drank a mouthful of water and listened to Li Xiaotong with narrowed eyes. He had heard the name Lin Banshan many times. He only knew that this person was different from the rest of the Lin family. The Linyuan that Sulu had been to twice was his property. What made him feel a little strange was that when Li Xiaotong and Zhou Yu mentioned Lin Banshan's name, they would show a certain degree of respect and a little strange emotion. My eldest brother has no one in his eyes, only Lin Banshan. Li Xiaotong cut the vegetables on his plate. He lowered his head slightly, but the sincere smile on his face did not make the trace of malice disappear completely. He even looked down on your friend, the young master of the Tai family. Although I have always thought that my eldest brother has a good appearance, I have to admit that he is vigilant and respectful towards Lin Banshan. I am the same. Sulu knew what kind of person Lin Banshan was, but at least he did not need to know at this time. Lin Banshan said that when you open the door you have to see the mountain. When you see the mountain you are the mountain. You can stand still and let wind blow from all directions. Li Xiaotong put down his knife and fork, looked at Sulu across the table and said, "So I will get straight to the point. I don't care what problems there are between the family, you and the lady behind you. I want to establish some kind of personal friendship with you. This is why I asked you to come here today." That night in the Ivy Garden, Li Xiaotong had expressed a similar intention to Sulu, but there was no time to say it more thoroughly. Hearing this, Sulu was startled. He looked down at the ordinary jacket on the chair beside him and could not understand the other's meaning. That night, Li Xiaotong had asked Sulu to introduce him to Taizion at a suitable time, but Sulu believed that just this little bit of benefit was not enough for the other to formally meet him. "I think you should know that the data from the laboratory has already reached the Federal Academy of Science. Even if you want to ruin the plans of the young master of the Li family, I am of no use." Sulu replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. Until today, he felt like he was on the terrace of Macho's back mountain. He was really not used to this kind of atmosphere. Since the other party was willing to get straight to the point, he had no reason to hesitate. If it was said that Great Secretary Shin was willing to work with Sulu because of his relationship with Tai Ziyuan, and because he knew very well that Sulu held in his hands mecha data that could affect the presidential election, then what about Li Xiaotong? Sulu did not think that a small character like himself had any right to win the other's personal friendship. This is indeed a very regrettable matter. That elder brother of mine was persuaded by that old fox, Senator Macklin, and burrowed headlong into the presidential election. He thinks that this is a very delicious cake, but in my opinion, he is not doing his job properly. Li Xiaotong smiled, but the sinister look between his brows was still thick. But that night I told you that I don't care at all about the presidential election. No matter how the president of the Federation changes, the 7 major families are still the same 7 major families. This is something that history has long since proven. But I am still the type of person that your family doesn't like, said Sulu. As long as I like it. Li Xiaotong sipped the champagne in his glass and said slowly, our Li family has always been doing business. That elder brother of mine has been doing well these past few years, and the old men in the family all like him very much. They actually allowed him to cross the line, but they don't know that the deeper you cross the line, the greater the risk. I don't want to do that. Doing business is for the sake of making money, why bother with those things? Sulu felt that Li Xiaotong was about to get to the point. I am not Li Xiaozhu. I am a businessman, and I only do what a businessman should do. Li Xiaotong stared into his eyes and said, I want to invest in you. I don't know what potential value I have that is worth the investment of the 7th young master of the Li family. You underestimate yourself. Li Xiaotong looked at him quietly and said, without data, you still have this person who can easily break through the defense of the Ivy Garden and the 3 layers of scanning of the Research Institute. I can't let such an unfathomable guy go so easily. Of course, I definitely won't invest in you as an assassin. Brother Zhang still stood calmly and silently behind Li Xiaotong. Just from this, Sulu knew that Li Xiaotong was not an ordinary person. The powerful bodyguard that the family had sent to his side was unexpectedly not guarded against. This showed that this person's ability was extraordinary. Perhaps this is a gamble, but I'm willing to take it. Li Xiaotong continued. I think even Lady Tai is willing to meet him in person. If I bet on him, even if I lose, I won't lose too much. Sulu was slightly startled. He didn't expect that what gave Li Xiaotong confidence was the meeting at the back mountain of Macho the day before. With an elder leading the way, if I don't know how to follow him to get a bowl of soup to eat, then I don't deserve to be a businessman. Of course there is a risk in investing, but it is precisely this kind of risk that brings benefits. You don't know that Lady Tai rarely sees people, but I am willing to bet on you not only because of this, but also because of what you have shown in this matter. Li Xiaotong suddenly laughed. The Federation is a place with rules. Whether it is the old men in my family, the lady of the Tai family, or even Commander Zhong in the Westwoods, they all have to follow certain rules to do things, but you are different. Li Xiaotong narrowed his eyes and stared at his face with great seriousness. He said, there is something about you that doesn't stick to one pattern. Those unreasonable axes of yours actually made my elder brother, and those hypocrites at the Academy of Science look so pathetic. In this world where rules must be followed, you don't follow the rules. This is why you are destined to either die an extremely miserable death in the future, or you will fight for a completely different future. The last person in this circle who didn't follow the rules like this was Lin Banshan. No matter how arrogant that little madman of the Li family is, there is still the old man who can firmly suppress him. Other than Lin Banshan and you, I can't see anyone else in this circle who can't find something above their heads that can suppress you. I also have to follow the rules, so even though I know that Park Ji-ho jumped into the arms of my big brother, I can't do anything about it. He also saw this point, so he was so presumptuous. Speaking of which, I have to thank you for helping me kill him. Li Xiaotong's tone became indifferent. But the problem now is that if I also follow the rules, this family will never be mine, so I have to invest in a person who doesn't follow the rules at all. A few days ago I didn't make up my mind. Li Xiaotong's cold and stubborn face, like a plum blossom, showed a trace of a sad expression. But your unreasonable axes in the lab really hit my weak point. The lethality of this kind of resentful expression was really too great. If Shi Qinghai showed this kind of expression, it would probably be a bit tempting. If the beautiful young master of the Li family, Li Xiuzhu, showed this kind of expression, it would probably be a bit charming. Only Li Xiaotong was gloomy, surrounded by flowers, but he sighed faintly. It couldn't help but be like a pine tree that was pressed down by snow suddenly became delicate like a flower in a greenhouse, making people feel helpless. In Zhou Yu's words, Su Lu was an outsider who didn't even understand what was going on, so he was completely unreasonable and ignorant. In terms of mechanics, he was talented. In terms of recognizing people, and in terms of calmness, he was talented, but in the end he was still a stubborn stone that had not been polished. He was stubborn, but he was slightly clumsy, and he didn't understand a lot of things. After staying silent at the table for a long time, Su Lu used the mind of an engineer to carefully arrange the things needed in his plan, and then he found that no matter whether what the young master of the Li family said was true or not, it seemed that he really didn't have anything that he couldn't lose in this federation. So he grinned and said seriously, "I need a lot of money." In the suburbs of the southwest corner of the capital special district, several highways converged here, and then extended to the various states of the Federation planet S1. It was 9 o'clock at night, and the highways were brightly lit, but there were not many cars driving. On the contrary, behind a mountain next to the highway, there was a road without streetlights on both sides, but it was very lively and noisy. Countless famous brand sports cars gathered here, and the modified headlights emitted dazzling light, illuminating the usually quiet and almost abandoned road. A motorcade of 4 cars got off the highway out of the city and went around the hill. The scene of horns on both sides of the road became much quieter because of the arrival of the motorcade. Countless pairs of eyes looked over, and many people recognized the blue Silver Wraith. The Silver Wraith was the most expensive sports car in the Federation, but this Silver Wraith was not silver, and it was even more famous on the side of the hill road. Not everyone knew that this Silver Wraith belonged to the second heir of the Li family, but everyone knew that the owner of this car had a cold temperament, and was an extremely big shot that was not to be trifled with. Their attention was attracted by the Silver Wraith, and not many people noticed the unmarked, ordinary-looking black car in the convoy. The motorcade drove to the end of the mountain road, and then it slowly came to a stop on the extremely quiet high ground. Li Xiaotong and Su Lu got out of their cars and looked at the lively scene on the road not far from their feet. Their bodyguard, Brother Zhang, stood behind them indifferently. It was not appropriate to describe Su Lu and Li Xiaotong at this time, as each of them had ulterior motives. Su Lu did not have the ability to scheme in front of these children of aristocratic families, and for a big shot like the 7th young master of the Li family to condescend to associate with Su Lu, he naturally had some ulterior motives, but the ulterior motive was still far away, not in the immediate interests. Since Li Xiaotong decided to establish a personal friendship with this young second lieutenant, they naturally needed to get along and see each other's temperament. A meal was far from enough, so he took Su Lu to the western suburbs of the capital, the paradise of the reckless racing gang. "I know that your girlfriend has been dead for half a year." Li Xiaotong glanced at Su Lu next to him and said calmly, "I have a lot of properties in the 13 great roads, and those high-class prostitutes have to give in to me. But you are not willing to accept, so I have to take you here to see." Su Lu was silent. He did not know if Li Xiaotong had any deep meaning when he mentioned Zhang Xiaoming's death. He had never forgotten the life and death separation hidden behind the political dark of the Federation. He had forcibly seized the data left by Professor Shen. At this time, he stood with the 7th young master of the Li family. On one hand, he wanted to fight for the honor that Professor Shen deserved, and on the other hand, he wanted to make arrangements for his own plan. What was strange was that although the Li family's 7th young master was so rich that he could kill people, he didn't have too many displeasing behaviors. Su Lu gradually understood the so-called aristocratic family's younger generation. The richer and more powerful they were, the more low-key they would be. However, what made him feel a little strange was that Li Xiaotong, who was gloomy and indifferent, was extremely careful with his tone of voice when talking to him. In this regard, Li Xiaotong was even better than Taizun. He did not reveal a trace of a natural sense of superiority. This was something that should be hidden in the bones of the children of the aristocratic families, but Li Xiaotong was able to hide it so well. Su Lu thought silently. He was afraid that Li Xiuzhu, the true successor, would really have to be careful. Sulu had been silent, but Li Xiaotong did not have any opinion. He pointed to the sports cars on the road and said with a smile, "When I first met you at the entrance of Qingshan Park, I knew that you didn't like the way the rich people race cars. They don't care about human lives. But it's different here." This was originally the Shoujing Expressway. Later, a new road was built, and the old road was abandoned. There have always been very few cars and pedestrians passing by here. Moreover, the guys who race cars are all professionals, so they are very safe. "I'm not interested in racing." Sulu shook his head. "Is that so? That day on the number 2 expressway, you chased me and Zhou until we were in a bit of a mess." Li Xiaotong smiled and said, "Of course, you are now used to driving the Crown Prince's special car. Looking at these so-called brand-name sports cars, it's natural that you don't like them." Sulu shook his head again. He noticed that there was a temporary makeshift house on the side of the road. There was a faint blue light from a computer screen in the makeshift house. After thinking for a while, he guessed what was going on there. He said with a hint of surprise, "Gambling is so professional? Don't underestimate the gambling here." 12 years ago, Lin Banshan started his business here. Li Xiaotong's expression calmed down. When he mentioned that person's name, he couldn't help but have a trace of fascination. He said slowly, "Back then the Lin family was like our Li family now. Several of their children were very outstanding. In order to compete for the recognition of the previous generation, they were very busy. Lin Banshan was the youngest in their generation, but he was also the most promising one." He suddenly shook his head and exclaimed, "As a result, on my 18th birthday, Lin Banshan sneered in front of all the guests and family elders in the courtyard and said, 'I'm too lazy to accept this kind of family business.' After saying this, he ate a piece of cake, kowtowed to his parents 3 times, and left the Lin family without looking back." Hearing this story, Sulu couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Lin Banshan was proud but not stupid. It was just that at that time he was too rebellious in his bones. Seeing his brothers frowning every day, he felt disdain. He didn't want this family business, so he left in a carefree manner. He wanted to fight for his own country. After leaving the Lin family, Lin Banshan's first stop was here. At that time, the capital New Expressway had just opened. He opened a casino here, gambling on racing. In less than half a year, he made his first pot of gold. Then, he used the money to buy the hostel-like restaurant in HTD Bureau, which is now Linyuan. Linyuan. Sulu knew that Linyuan was Lin Banshan's business, but he didn't expect that many years ago, Lin Banshan, who had vaguely become a legend, could actually buy that piece of land with the income from illegal racing. "So don't underestimate the income here," Li Xiaotong said calmly. "We are all children of aristocratic families, and we all know how rich the family business is." Lin Banshan said he didn't want it and left in a carefree and arrogant manner. "I grew up with a golden spoon in my mouth, but I don't have his courage. I feel ashamed just thinking about it." The 7 families of the Federation were not ordinary families, and they were not ordinary businesses. Even if they failed to fight for the right of inheritance and stayed at home, they could enjoy a lifetime of wealth and privileges that the citizens of the Federation could not imagine. But Lin Banshan left at the age of 18, leaving behind words of disdain, and left in such an arrogant manner. This universe, this federation, is made up of countless rules. The mysterious Lady Tai, the powerful president, and the noble army god still have to take care of the interests of all sides, constantly compromise and strive to find a balance between those lines. Li Xiaotong said indifferently, "Lin Banshan broke the rules, and I think one day maybe you can break it too. I'm not a member of this circle. For me, there are naturally no rules," Sulu replied. The modified sports car roared loudly. The car owners who were fussy about speed were naturally unwilling to use electric power or hybrid power, and the pungent smell of strong gasoline gradually filled the road. On the road at the foot of the mountain, a curvaceous girl was waving a flag, leading the car onto the track. From time to time, a wrecked car would be dragged back by a heavy-duty tractor. There were ambulances on standby at the bottom of the road. Everything seemed to be in order, but the cursing and whistling all around revealed the darkness and danger hidden in this place. Sulu calmly watched the scene unfold on the mountain. He did not pay attention to the winning or losing of these sports cars, But he was thinking about the person called Lin Banshan and the reason why the seventh young master of the Li family brought him here. According to Li Xiaotong, Lin Banshan had not returned to this hill for many years, and the casino here had long been transferred to someone else. But the rules set by this person 12 years ago were still there, and no one dared to make any changes and no one dared to violate these rules. He had not returned for many years, but his influence was still so strong. It had to be said that the trader of the Lin family was a very bad person. Do you want to play a little bet? Li Xiaotong looked at the silent Su Lu, and felt more and more that his investment was very good. He had never seen a young man who could be so calm in a place like this where hormones were at their peak. If the Federation was full of people like Su Lu, then no matter how arrogant Lin Banshan was, he would not have been able to make much money. If I had money, I would not ask you for money, Su Lu said with a smile, but his eyes narrowed. He found that in the waiting sports car on the road below, there was a figure that he felt was familiar. Investment is one thing. The room we ate in today, just the decoration and the few broken paintings cost me more than 4 million. The money you want will naturally be transferred to your account tomorrow. It will be transferred to the account you set up for me, Su Lu corrected. Li Xiaotong smiled slightly, and the hem of his black coat swayed slowly in the night wind. He said, in addition to investment, it is also okay for friends to exchange what they need. You are not in a convenient situation, so I can lend you some money to make a small bet. It is not a bad idea. I don't borrow money. If I borrow money and return it, I will owe you a favor. Like you said, this is not the same as investment. Damn you. Li Xiaotong did not know if it was because he was used to acting gloomy in front of his brother and family elders. Even if he was angry and laughing at this time, there was still a sense of gloominess. He laughed and scolded. Can you take it as a gift? Why do I have to bet? Su Lu looked at him curiously. Li Xiaotong calmly replied. People who do business are very superstitious. I also pay attention to luck. If there is no accident, you are probably the riskiest and biggest investment I have made in my life. Tonight, I am here to try my luck and hope for a good start. If I lose the bet, you will continue to invest in me. Su Lu smiled and said. Then what is the point of us betting on cars? What if I win? At this time, a group of people near the hill suddenly became noisy. It seemed that they had made a big bet and were very confident, so those young masters were shouting something loudly. Just as Li Xiaotong said, there were rules everywhere in the Federation. Both sides of the road were crowded with excited people, but there were not many people on the hill. Only people with status could come here. It is the son of the deputy chairman. He does not know who I am and we have not talked before. Li Xiaotong glanced over and said to Su Lu. The deputy chairman of the Federation Management Committee was undoubtedly one of the most powerful people. Even Li Xiaotong was not willing to provoke his idiotic son. Su Lu glanced over and immediately withdrew his gaze. The white sports car down there is his. I heard that the driver is a professional driver specially invited from S3. The bonus one is not that much because the odds are so low. After all, this is an off-road race. No one dares to hope to win against a professional driver. Li Xiaotong pointed at the few cars on the road and said, this kind of game is actually very unruly, but no one is willing to care about him so they can only lower the odds. Look at the cars next to that one. They are not famous in the circle. Obviously, the owner is giving face to the deputy chairman's son and letting him have a good time. All these years, under the suppression of his dazzling elder brother, the seventh young master of the Li family had been pretending to be a ruthless playboy, playing with beautiful women on various planets of the Federation. He was very clear about these matters. Lend me $1 million. Su Lu narrowed his eyes, looked at the road and suddenly said, lend not give. Giving is a favor. I will return it to you. Legends don't appear every day in this place. Gambling like yours will really make you lose a lot. Li Xiaotong did not care about $1 million. He simply followed Su Li's eyes and found that the man next to him was staring at a race car. No matter how it is modified, that race car will always lose, Li Xiaotong said. Even if Lin Banshan drove it himself 12 years ago, it would still lose. Gambling is bound to lose just like when you invested in me. Su Lu looked at the inconspicuous race car, and the man next to the car who looked like a delicate woman. He narrowed his eyes and said, The risk of $1 million is not as great as the risk of you betting on me. That makes sense. I always thought that you were too calm and silent. You are young, but you are old and rusty. It is rare for you to go crazy. Of course, I have to take a look. Li Xiaotong laughed and asked his men to place their bets. Sulu looked at the delicate man next to the race car. His expression was calm, but he was thinking about something else. He was not a gambler. He was curious about the famous Lin Banshan, but he was not interested in betting on this kind of racing. He was only interested in the delicate man. After all, he would be spending time with the delicate man in the future. He wanted to know what kind of person he was. Not many people cared about this race. The odds were too different. The winner had been decided long ago. Very few people placed bets. Except for the chairman's son on the hill who threw in hundreds of thousands of dollars out of boredom, there were basically no bets. Suddenly, on the light screen outside the makeshift room, there was an additional 1 million, which immediately caused a commotion in the room. According to the current odds, if the race car won, the chairman's son would have to fork out 7 million. Such a big bet was rare, even when Lin Banshan was personally holding the line. The crowd on the other side of the hill cast strange glances at Li Xiaotong and Su Lu. There were not many people who could spend a lot of money to buy a quick profit. Only these two groups of people on the hill had the ability to do so. However, the people on the other side did not expect that their professional racer would lose. The deputy chairman's son even thought that this group of people deliberately lost a lot of money to him in order to make friends with him. More than 10 minutes later, everyone saw a very shocking scene. The race car, which seemed like it would fall apart at any time, slowly came back. Its speed was as slow as the broken carriage pulled by an old cow in ancient fairy tales. But the problem was that there was no other sports car behind the race car. Even the famous sports car driven by the professional racer was nowhere to be seen. Near the turning point in the distance of the old Shoujing Expressway, flames could be vaguely seen. No one knew what happened, but the heavy trailer and ambulance rushed away. There was a dead silence on both sides of the road. It was not until the delicate man climbed out of the race car that there was a burst of ear-piercing screams and cheers. Li Xiaotong indifferently looked at the bustling scene on the road. He looked at the delicate driver and slowly turned his head to look at Su Lu. He said, "Looks like we found another guy who doesn't follow the rules tonight." He had layers of doubts in his heart. How did Su Lu know that the race car was a crazy guy who was not afraid of death, and was not afraid of killing people? The racer was so delicate, as gentle and calm as a virgin. There are many unreasonable things in the Federation, but there are also many coincidences. Su Lu looked at the delicate man who was walking up the hill. He lowered his head and said, "Maybe you don't believe it, but I just saw this person today. He is my secretary." How much money a racer could get all depended on how much he bet on himself. Only then could he get a bonus. The White Magnolia needed money, so he had come here tonight to gamble with his life. However, if he hadn't placed a bet of 1 million, even if he had risked his life, he would only be able to get $110,000 from the son of the chairman. So he went up the hill personally to thank the person who had given him a lot of money. This had nothing to do with courtesy. He only respected people who could give him money. So when Bai Yulan saw that the person who had helped him earn a lot of money was actually the young technical director he had met today, his expression became a little strange. But he did not say anything. He said thank you to Su Lu and left the hill. This kind of desperate driving method, not to hurt others but to hurt oneself first. It hasn't happened for a long time. Li Xiaotong looked at the delicate figure on the hill and reminded Su Lu, this kind of unruly driving method is very easy to get into trouble. Do you want to send some people to take him home? Su Lu did not say anything. He just thought about the delicate hands holding the folder. It was these delicate hands that drove the Sito so crazily. It was these delicate hands that forced the professional racer into a dead end. A person with such a pair of hands would not die so easily. Li Xiaotong walked to the son of the chairman. Even if it was the son of the deputy speaker of the Federation, losing 7 million all of a sudden, his expression became extremely ugly or embarrassed. However, it was unknown what the seventh young master of the Li family said, but the speaker's son returned to his usual arrogance and nodded lightly. I will transfer the money that this prodigal lost to you. Li Xiaotong walked back to Su Lu. Looking at the chaos at the foot of the hill, he said, it seems that my investment will be very good. After that night, Su Li's life returned to a dull and boring state. He lived in the apartment in Wangdu every day, worked in the farm-like headquarters of the Whitewater Company in the commercial district, and occasionally talked to Zhou Yu on the phone or had a meal with Li Xiaotong. He looked at the faces of the small stars in the Federation in front of money and wealth. It was more or less the same as before, but there were some differences. He met with Zhou Yu a few times and passed a part of the data model to him. However, he kept the direct results of his and Professor Shun's research. Li Xiaotong's large sum of money had already been transferred to his account. Su Lu began to buy the equipment and components he needed through the black market like an ant-moving house. Su Lu didn't know how the Federal Academy of Sciences project was progressing. He also didn't know what influence Secretary Shen had on the Nutshell Engineering Department. He didn't even know the details of the engineering department's research on the new generation of the Federation's mecha. But he asked the other party to give him data feedback. The resources that needed to be prepared were prepared. The total data that needed to be obtained was also in his hands. The only thing that needed to be done was the failed prototype MX in the Whitewater Company. His secretary, Bai Yulan, came to his office to report once a day and then couldn't find him again. This delicate man's attitude towards Su Lu didn't change at all because of the bet that night. He was still as gentle as ever, but he was still as cold as ever. Just like that, 10 days passed. Su Lu felt extremely tired. At this moment he couldn't help but think of Shi Qinghai. He thought of the days when he and Mr. Shi worked together to fight against the Federation Investigation Bureau. The Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department were in a secret competition. However, even though he had the core data, he couldn't do anything about it. He didn't even completely trust the Tai family, let alone Li Xiaotong. Secretary Bai was also cold to him. He didn't have a single partner by his side. This kind of pressure was too great. Shi Qinghai smiled as he looked at the surveillance camera on the door. His hands were behind his back, holding the Taiping axe that he had picked up in the corridor earlier. Then he swung the axe down. He completely ignored the apartment's complete surveillance and alarm system and smashed the door open. The alarm didn't sound. Shi Qinghai kicked the person behind the door to the ground. After closing the door, he dragged the axe and walked towards the person on the ground. The temperature in the apartment was extremely low. In this late spring and early summer, the owner of the apartment was still wearing a fitted synthetic sweater. Shi Qinghai didn't say a word to the man whose eyes were flickering. He swung the axe down and chopped off the man's right hand. Blood spurted out and the man screamed in pain. Shi Qinghai exhaled softly. His handsome face was full of satisfaction. He praised, "You made me so hard to find." Chapter 203. After all, the blood in a human body was not the same as the water stored in a fire engine. After gushing out from the severed wrist, the blood was depleted in an instant, dripping and soaking the synthetic blanket in front of the sofa. The blanket was full of blood, and its color became extremely dark and heavy. However, the smell of blood was not absorbed, and instead it began to spread around the room. The middle-aged man in the synthetic sweater was called Wang Xian, a very ordinary name, and a very ordinary person. At this time he had lost an arm and his face was pale. However, after the scream, he stubbornly pursed his lips and did not say a word. He used his left hand to press down on the joint of his right arm. He did not want to die from excessive blood loss, and he also did not think that this beautiful man in front of him would kill him immediately. People who did this kind of work were always extremely careful. The way they died was usually through betrayal or being silenced by their superiors. It was very rare for an enemy to come directly to their door and cut off their arm in such a violent scene. Wang Xian raised his head and looked at the beautiful man in front of him with resentful eyes. He did not ask how the other party found his place, although this was his biggest curiosity. He only forced himself to be calm and said, "What do you want?" The simple surveillance system and alarm system outside the apartment did not have the slightest reaction when the other party broke in. It seemed that the other party had already cleaned the surroundings of the apartment in advance. Although Wang Xian was only an intelligence officer, his ability to protect himself was not bad. However, in front of the other party he could not even block a single kick, and he could not avoid that tyrannical axe. Combining these two situations, he knew how terrifying the enemy was today. More importantly, he recognized the real identity of this beautiful man at a glance. He began to feel fear and despair, but the other party did not immediately kill him, and he smelled a trace of opportunity. Shi Qinghai took out a pack of 37 brand cigarettes from his pocket, lit one and took a deep breath. He crouched beside the pool of blood and took a wallet from Wang Xian's body. Through the phone of Senator Macklin's secretary, Helen, he obtained some information, but the information was too vague and too jumbled. It took him a full 3 days to sort through the information before he found the person in front of him named Wang Xian. This person was nominally a staff member of the S2 Mountain Ring 4 States Peace Foundation, but the number of times he appeared in Helen's phone seemed to be a little too much. Starting from this point of suspicion, he began to secretly investigate Wang Xian, paying special attention to this person's movements before the 1st of January of the 67th year of the constitutional calendar. He graduated from the first military academy with the highest grades, and was one of the most successful anti-government army spies in the Federation. No matter how well Wang Xian's cover, he still found many problems. "You should know me." While rummaging through his wallet, Shi Qinghai said vaguely with a cigarette in his mouth, "So you should know very well that I'm here for revenge. It'll be very difficult for you to survive. But before you die, I'd like to know one thing. How did Senator Macklin send the information to Yang Jingsong of the Department of Defense when he learned that the source of danger was going to Linhai State Stadium?" Some of the ashes flew down with the slight movement of his lips, landing on the dark and bloody carpet. He continued calmly, "I've been investigating for a long time, and Macklin did indeed talk to Yang Jingsong on the phone. But with Yang Jingsong's enmity towards the comrades in the mountains, he shouldn't believe it so easily. So there must be another group of people who vouched for him." Shi Qinghai smiled slightly, and a kind expression appeared on his delicate face. "Tell me who that group of people is. Also, I believe that you must have some evidence that can embarrass Senator Macklin. Please give it to me as well." The other party was a military officer. "I don't know who's behind him, but there was one time when I found out that it seemed to be a big shot in Parliament Mountain. At first, I thought it was someone from the 7 great families, but after some analysis, I don't think so." Wang Xian leaned on the sofa, his eyes staring blankly at the blood dripping from his wrist. Without any hesitation, he confessed according to Shi Qinghai's request. He used to be a member of the organization, so he was very clear about the severity of the organization's punishment for traitors. Although this beautiful man in front of him seemed to have left the organization and become a wandering ghost, since he was able to become the organization's most successful spy in the capital ring of the Federation, the other party must have more tricks up his sleeve. He knew that he couldn't survive those tricks, and there was no loss for him and Senator Macklin to betray their partner. Did the military officer have any special characteristics? A standard professional soldier in the Federation. He used a military encrypted phone. I tried to eavesdrop on him a few times, but I failed. I couldn't follow him either. Wang Xian panted. "What I want are the real characteristics." He was wearing a wig. His real hair should be maroon red. Maroon red hair was indeed rare in the Federation, but there were at least a few million people in the population of tens of billions. After a moment of silence, Shi Qinghai said, "Looks like you're quite meticulous. That's all for this clue. Next up is the second one. I need something that can make Senator Macklin uncomfortable." This was the 3rd time Shi Qinghai had mentioned the word, comrade. A strange expression appeared on Wang Xian's pale face. He panted and said, "I only asked you to give me a quick death. You know very well that I can't fulfill this request of yours." Shi Qinghai threw the wallet on the floor and took out a photo. It was a photo of Wang Xian, his wife and daughter. He put the photo in front of Wang Xian's eyes and didn't say a word. He just waited for the other party's answer. Wang Xian bit his lip and didn't say a word. He knew that the other party was using his family's life to threaten him, but he still didn't say anything. Shi Qinghai frowned and looked at the photo carefully. Suddenly, he tore open a corner of the photo with 2 nimble fingers. It turned out that the photo was actually double-layered. After tearing open the top layer, he could see another photo underneath. Wang Xian's originally extremely pale complexion became even uglier at this time. The photo underneath was also a family photo, but the woman and child in it were different from the first photo. As a special agent, you made a fatal mistake. People like us don't have the right to expect love and family, not to mention having such a cute child. Shi Qinghai threw the photo on the floor beside Wang Xian. He picked up the axe and gently placed it on the photo. The sharp edge of the axe just happened to rest on the neck of the cute little girl in the photo. Even if you have a family, you should be more careful. What's the use of double-layered photos when you can't carry them around? This kind of artistic aura can really kill people. Don't implicate the wife and child. Wang Xian stared at Shi Qinghai with resentment. Don't forget the rules of the organization. Since the massacre 30 years ago, the organization has strictly prohibited the use of such violent means. If you dare to do so, the disciplinary committee won't let you go. Even you will have to bear the pain and behead you. When you betrayed my teacher, did you think about the consequences? Shi Qinghai's expression was calm, but his voice was incomparably cold. I believe you didn't, so I won't think about the consequences. I don't belong to any organization. I'm just carrying out a very simple revenge. Wang Xian's expression was gloomy. He knew that he was going to die today, but he had to think about his daughter. He knew that the handsome man in front of him could be a terrifying killing machine when he turned cold. Half an hour later, Shi Qinghai tidied up everything in the apartment. He checked the recording pen and the transferred data on him one last time. He walked out of the room and closed the door that had been cut open by the axe. Next to the sofa behind the door, the already dead Wang Xian lay in a pool of blood with his eyes closed. Taking the subway to the old airport in the capital, Shi Qinghai silently walked to a stove in the corner, while listening to the street music of street performers hitting empty cannon shells. The weather in the late spring had begun to become hot and dry. No one was willing to go near the stove. There were only some remnants of incense ashes used to worship the dead. It seemed that the Yulan festival had just passed away. Taking off his gloves and shoes, Shi Qinghai put them into the fire. He calmly looked at the suddenly rising flames, as if he saw his teacher's chubby, sometimes serious, sometimes cute face in the flames. Su Lu and Shi Qinghai had lost contact for a long time. He didn't know that Mr. Shi was getting closer to the truth of the matter step by step. He even had some evidence that Senator Macklin was involved in the assassination in Linhai State. The problem was that both of them were young people who walked the path of revenge alone. Even if they had evidence in their hands, they probably wouldn't know where to send it. The wife of the Tai family should have been the most angry person. However, in the context of the Great Reconciliation of the Federation, and the fact that Senator Macklin represented the collective will of the people in the 4 states around the mountains, the political figures in the Federation probably wouldn't want to take such a risk when the election was about to begin. The computer screen showed the number in the account. Seeing so much money under his control for the first time, even someone as calm as Su Lu couldn't help but feel a little lost for a moment. Until today, he still didn't fully understand why the 7th young master of the Li family was willing to invest in him. An eclectic axe? This statement was too idealistic and too artistic. It shouldn't be the temperament of a calm businessman. Secretary Bai Yulan walked in and took the Weapons Maintenance Fund application documents that required Su Li's signature. He walked out of the room. These days, this delicate man still kept a distance from Su Lu. Half a minute later, Bai Yulan suddenly returned to the office. He looked at Su Lu for a long time and said, "There are some problems in the armory. Do you want to go take a look after work?" Chapter 204. Su Lu was silent, but that didn't mean he was dull. Su Lu was always smiling, but that didn't mean he was heartless. The environment he grew up in and his education background made it impossible for him to fully understand some methods of using people. Even if he understood, it might be difficult for him to do it with his temperament. So, since escaping from the Eastwood region, he had not had a single partner or helper except for a few friends who shared the same bad habits but ended up with bad endings because of this stubborn stench. Of course, it was a bit harsh to ask an orphan who had just turned 20 years old to suddenly become a powerful child of power. However, as an orphan who had been living in Bell Tower Street for several years, Su Lu was able to safely pass his adolescence. Apart from Uncle Feng Yu's care, Su Li's ability to observe people's expressions wasn't bad. In the words of that uncle, This kid seemed to have a natural ability to discern people's hearts. Su Lu was able to figure out what the people around him wanted in a very short time. For example, Li Wei wanted respect, so he wanted power and fists. For example, Zhang Xiaoming wanted to follow in the footsteps of that old bastard, St. George. She wanted to take advantage of her youth and childishness to do the right thing, then turn into a sky full of fireworks, regardless of other people's tears. For example, Shi Qinghai wanted peace, but because of that director's leap, it became a bubble secretary by Yulan needed money. Although he didn't know where his urgent desire for money came from that night's car race on the old road of Shoujing Expressway, it could be seen that this delicate man was willing to give up his life for money. His behavior after the event also proved that this person respected money very much. The organizational structure of the Whitewater Company was somewhat similar to the military structure, but there were also some very different aspects. The most different aspect was reflected in the power of the technical director. The company's combat personnel undertook the task of testing new weapons for the federal military, guarding engineering spaceships on peripheral planets, or carrying out some dark missions for the Federation government. The performance of the new weapons in these battles indirectly determined the time series when the new weapons officially entered the Federal Army's standard equipment. The technical supervisor assigned to the combat team also had more power because of this background. After all, the experimental data of the new weapon and the tracking monitoring needed to be controlled by these technical supervisors. The technicians who were sent to the Whitewater Company from the Research Institute or the Engineering Department were undoubtedly sent away, but they had extremely high authority in their respective teams, just like Su Lu. Team 7, which Su Lu belonged to, was a little different from the other combat teams. This was because they were now part of the Security Consultant Department. This department was the most peripheral and least valued department in Whitewater Security Company. It was specifically responsible for the comprehensive planning of the personal safety of some of the influential figures in the Federation. In short, it was bodyguards. The first time he met Secretary Bai, Su Lu knew that the other party was not an ordinary person. The race that night had strengthened his confidence. Therefore, he did not understand why Team 7, which had a person like Bai Yulan, was not valued by the company. She was assigned to the Security Consulting Department, and did not receive any business for half a year. Most importantly, Team 7 did not have a combat team leader. The highest ranking officer was Su Lu, the technical director. This kind of personnel structure was strange. The dark armory was full of the smell of engine oil. The gradually setting sun could not shine into this forgotten corner. A week after entering the headquarters of the Whitewater Company, Su Lu found out that the underground of the headquarters, which looked like a farm, was actually a very large comprehensive base. The armory and the training ground were all underground. I used to be the leader of Team 7, but I committed a crime and was dismissed. However, the higher-ups also know that the guys in this team are not very obedient. It is useless to send a new leader. Bai Yulan was leaning against a scrapped self-propelled vehicle. Her delicate hands were in her purse, and there was a hint of coldness between her delicate eyebrows. However, the smell of engine oil in the armory and the scattered weapons and equipment made her look different from her usual self. She was like a decadent artistic youth who suddenly stood beside an oil brush. She no longer looked like a lady but started to look like a real soldier. She was like a decadent artistic youth who suddenly stood beside an oil brush. This was Team 7's exclusive armory. The weapons and equipment inside looked to be in good condition, but they had not been maintained for a long time. No one knew how long they could last on the battlefield. Su Lu lay on the skateboard and looked at the internal structure of the self-propelled missile through his goggles. He was sure that if this weapon was transported to a mineral star to fight, it would only need to fire 2 shots before it would fall apart. Bai Yulan's gaze was a little cold, and there was a trace of loneliness hidden in that coldness. She looked at the 2 legs that extended out from under the self-propelled gun, and her heart trembled slightly. She thought to herself that if this gun were to collapse at this moment, the person below would probably die more thoroughly. I don't know who you offended and who sent you to Team 7, but since you are here, I am afraid you will not be able to get out. Su Lu was still under the self-propelled missile. She did not know what he was busy with, but she did not answer. Bai Yulan did not seem to care. She was just calmly narrating some things. She had never known the background of this young technical director, who did not seem to be anything out of the ordinary. However, when she saw him standing on the hill during the race that night, she began to be vigilant. Especially after seeing the check of 1.2 million today. Although Bai Yulan wasn't very curious about Sulu, her attitude towards him had changed a lot. I'll just treat it as telling a story. Because of the smell of the check, he thought in his heart and waited for the other party's real request. The skateboard rattled as Sulu finally crawled out from under the self-propelled gun. Looking at the equipment around the armory, he couldn't help but shake his head and ask, "Is this the armory for our team? Do we have to carry equipment every time we go out on a mission?" Hearing the words "our team," Bai Yulan's eyebrows trembled. Her hands were still in her pockets, but they gradually clenched. For her, Team 7 would always belong to her and her brothers. No one should even think about getting a share of it. Every combat team has its own armory. According to the information obtained by the technical director from the company, the armory is distributed in batches. Sulu used detergent to wash the stains off his hands. He walked in front of her. After a moment of silence, he said, "The security consulting department. How can they have so much firepower? The equipment here is enough to occupy a small mineral star." Bai Yulan lowered her head and looked at the tips of her smooth leather shoes. Her eyes were soft and gentle. She smiled and said, "Team 7 was originally the company's ace combat team. I used to be the captain." She was still gentle and delicate, with a cold smile. She was very much like a proud and calm girl. However, Sulu felt a different emotion from Bai Yulan for the first time. It was probably the so-called pride of a soldier. Ace combat team? Sulu understood why he felt a sense of vigilance when he saw her for the first time. The Whitewater Company's ace combat team had always been carrying out dark missions assigned by the government. They spent most of their time in bloody battles in various parts of the universe. Their combat experience was probably much richer than the Federal Military Special Forces. It was even possible that they were a secret Federal Military Special Forces and were just training in the Whitewater Company. How could such a team have fallen to such a state? You just said something happened. What is it? Sulu looked at Bai Yulan and asked. The information I just told you is a gift from me. From now on, one question for 100,000. Secretary Bai retracted one of her feet. She put her hands in her pockets and lightly kicked the ground with the tip of her foot. No problem. When we were carrying out a mission last year, our team took on a private job. Although the mission was successful in the end, the losses were too heavy. You took on a private job because you were short of money? Yes. Is 120,000 enough? It's close. Just a little more. What mission did you carry out last year? It involves Federation secrets. Since you yourself don't know, then I can't tell you. 500,000 for this question. I love money and need money, but I love the Federation's laws and this little life of mine even more, Sir Supervisor. Was it to test the Federation's new generation MX mecha? Bai Yulan slowly raised his head. The foot that had been lightly kicking the ground also stepped forward. He stood coldly and looked at Sulu. After a long time he said, "Yes. I'm done with my questions." Sulu didn't ask this delicate man why he was so desperate for money. He only smiled at him and continued to say, "I've become very rich for some reason now. If you need anything you can ask me. I can take on private jobs, but I don't do things that are illegal," said Bai Yulan lightly, his tone incomparably calm and harmless. At this time, Sulu already understood Secretary Shin's arrangement. Back when Macho had been negotiating at the back of the mountain terrace, he had suggested that he wanted to observe the development of the new mecha from the closest distance. However, he couldn't show his face in the engineering department, so the other side had actually chosen such an unexpected method to send him to the side of the few people in the Federation who had personally operated the new generation MX mecha. Of course it's not illegal, said Sulu. It's something personal. Personal matters are often troublesome matters. Bai Yulan lowered his eyes and looked at Suli's hand that was covered in the color of detergent. He said slowly, I can sell my life for money, but I also want to sell it clearly. That delicate pair of hands pulled out of his pocket, a military knife in his right hand. Bai Yulan said in a low voice, but if you want our team, then this isn't a matter of money. I can't let a young spoiled brat like you drag all 30 of us into a pit. Sulu looked at the delicate military knife in his delicate hand and said, Slightly taken aback, "What do you want to do?" Actually, if this sentence had been said by the delicate Bai Yulan, perhaps the scene would have been better. But Bai Yulan only smiled and walked over to him, saying, "If you want to buy Team 7, then at least let me see your true strength. If you're not strong enough, how can you have the right to make such a request?" Sulu was speechless. He still couldn't completely understand the logic of certain people, such as the logic of these Federation soldiers. He looked at the delicate man walking over with the delicate military knife, and could only clench his fists. Chapter 205. I have a nickname, it's called Magnolia Oil. Bai Magnolia said in a soft voice. That delicate military knife danced between his delicate fingers. The cold light was like a firefly, piercing through the air silently. I joined the army when I was 15 years old. After 10 years of fighting, I know how to operate 134 types of equipment. So in the army, they all think that I'm a veteran. Bai Magnolia's voice was still very gentle. He was reminding Sulu of something. After all, the other party was the technical supervisor in name. He couldn't really stab him. But there were rules in the army. Even though the 7th team was exiled to the farm headquarters at the edge of the concrete forest, they still had to follow their rules. Bai Magnolia also felt that this young civilian second lieutenant in front of him was a bit strange. He wanted to know more about him. Sulu narrowed his eyes and stared at the delicate military knife in Bai Yulan's hand that danced like a black elf. He didn't know when Bai Yulan had it in his hand. Listening to these indifferent words, he didn't have any intense emotions. His 2 feet slowly moved away from the cement floor, and the soles of his feet were firmly on the ground. He tilted his head and took a deep breath. His legs quickly shook, shaking up a few strands of dust on the ground. With an incredible speed, he pushed his whole body towards Bai Magnolia. The trembling of his legs was actually because he was moving very fast. It was just that he was moving so fast that it was somewhat dazzling. With a swoosh, the delicate military knife in Bai Magnolia's hand slashed down diagonally. It turned into a stream of light and for the first time, made a terrifying sound. At the same time, Bai Magnolia's pupils shrank. The tip of his leather shoes touched the ground. His whole body arched and he quickly retreated. He knew that Sulu, the technical supervisor, had some problems, so he had to test the other party today. However, he did not expect the other party to move at such a fast speed. More importantly, this speed was accompanied by an imposing aura. Bai Magnolia suddenly felt the danger that could only be felt on the battlefield. Without saying anything, he slashed forward with his arm, but his body retreated swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Suli's body seemed to be dodging instinctively. When he started, his legs moved quickly, but his upper body was abnormally stable. At this time, when he rushed in front of Bai Magnolia, his legs seemed to have grown roots. His upper body began to accurately and effectively dodge in a small area. The delicate military knife in Bai Yulan's hand flashed like lightning in the dark space of the armory, appearing and disappearing at the same time. His delicate hand seemed to have some kind of magical power that allowed him to play with an ordinary military knife in his hands, playing with it until it reached a certain realm. With a swoosh, Suli's clothes were cut open on his shoulder. His body crashed into Bai Magnolia's arms. His left hand blocked Bai Magnolia's upper body. Then, with a sneaky second thrust, his right hand went straight for Bai Magnolia's neck. Bai Magnolia cried out in a low voice. His right wrist twisted and went under Suli's left arm. The military knife shone with a cold light. It trembled and emitted a very thin light. It was about to go under Suli's ear. This move was indescribably fast and ruthless. At the beginning, they did not want to fight to the death. However, Bai Magnolia's military knife was too cold and dangerous. Sulu had been silent the whole time, but when he attacked, he did not show any mercy. When the two collided, they knew that neither of them were good people. Although they did not fight to the point of anger, at this critical moment they both felt a chill. Neither of them dared to slow down. Sulu looked at the cold light floating under his chin. His eyes narrowed. He flipped his left wrist and threw it out. It was the ugliest move of the 10 moves that Uncle had taught him. It was like a singer swinging his long sleeves, or a shrew trying to break free from her cowardly husband's hand. Although it was a little ugly, it was absolutely effective. His left arm, which was as hard as iron, directly hit By Magnolia's right wrist, making a loud paw sound. By Magnolia did not groan. His face was pale. He kicked towards Su Li's lower abdomen. His right hand, which had been thrown into the air, chopped towards Su Li's forehead. It was as if he wanted to use the cold light to cut Su Li's straight eyebrows into a few inches of dry twigs. Su Lu did not pay attention to the military knife coming towards his head. His feet scraped against the ground, and his body moved closer to the retreating By Magnolia. In an extremely short period of time, his left and right hands were like two sand hammers, striking towards his opponent's chest. Bam 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 bam. A series of muffled sounds rang out. By Magnolia's left hand was unable to block the two lightning-fast fists. With a muffled groan, the cold light flashed again. He lowered his head, pursed his lips, and a murderous look flashed across his delicate face. With a swish, the cold light on his right hand drew the word 1 in front of him. At the end of the stroke of the last word, the sharp tip of the military knife silently arrived an inch away from Su Li's carotid artery. It was as if a waterfall of blood could come out at any time. Magnolia's nickname in the military was Magnolia Oil. It wasn't just because he was young, but he was already a seasoned veteran. It was also because his former colleagues in the Federation's military were all very clear about the coldness of this delicate man who killed without batting an eyelid, and how slippery the delicate military knife in his hand was. Often, during close combat, the opponent would only notice the eye-catching cold glint in his eyes, but would die under the silent sneak attack of the delicate military knife. When the military knife cut open the carotid artery, the opponent's blood would spray onto his face. It could also spray onto the ceiling like a reverse waterfall. By Magnolia had killed countless people over the years. He didn't know how many enemies he had seen die just like that in front of him. He was a little numb to this kind of waterfall of blood. However, today he didn't want to kill Su Lu, but because of this inexplicable sense of danger, he used his killer move. His right index finger trembled slightly. He was ready to place the military knife on the opponent's weak neck and make the opponent admit defeat. However, at this moment, Su Li's shoulder suddenly rose. His right arm came from the outside and smashed horizontally. The heavy muffled sound echoed in the dark armory. By Magnolia lowered his head. His delicate brows were furrowed. He stood calmly. The military knife in his right hand was slightly stained with blood. His right leg was trembling non-stop. Su Lu stood in front of him. There were 7 or 8 slender cuts on his clothes. Only the cut on his shoulder was slowly oozing blood. By Magnolia raised his head and said softly, "What did you eat when you were growing up?" Su Lu was stunned. He said, "Beef?" By Magnolia smiled self-deprecatingly. His fingers twirled a flower, and he put the military knife back into the hidden sheath at his waist. He turned around and walked out of the armory. Su Li's last attack had been too powerful. His left arm, which was blocking the side of his face, felt like it was about to break. His right leg, which was supporting him and not falling down, began to tremble. Sweat seeped out of Su Li's hair and dripped onto the wound on his shoulder. Su Lu looked down and couldn't help but shake his head. By Magnolia's attack was indeed cunning and ruthless. If his reaction had been just a bit slower, that military knife would have slit his throat. He just felt a little confused. He fought for no reason and got injured, but he didn't really beat the other party into submission. Could this be the way the Federation soldiers did things? Su Lu thought to himself. Luckily, he was just a civilian soldier. At the end of the corridor in the Army General Hospital, the glass window was opened. The late spring scent of the garden downstairs seeped in. Su Lu lit a cigarette and smoked in silence. Bai Yulan was leaning against the wall of the corridor with his hands folded in his sleeves, silently looking at the scenery outside the window. His facial features were delicate and his expression was serene. Unfortunately, the bruise on his left cheek and his trembling thigh ruined this picture. Su Lu handed him a cigarette. Bai Magnolia didn't shake his head or accept it. Su Lu squatted down and continued to smoke his cigarette. Thinking of the people he saw in the intensive care unit, his mood became heavy. Bai Magnolia's family was in the intensive care unit. Bai Magnolia was born on planet S2. His parents both worked in the Federation's heavy manufacturing factory. Because of a leak accident, they were poisoned and laid in the hospital. Before we came, I told you that this is a very tacky story. By Magnolia looked coldly at the treetops swaying in the spring breeze outside the window. The Federation's government provides medical compensation. It's enough for my parents to lie in the hospital bed until they die of natural exhaustion. But I want them to stay in the best ward. I also hired 6 special nurses, so there's a lot of spending. Sulu squatted in front of him and used his hand to wipe away the fine bloodstains on his shoulder. The company's salary and benefits have always been good. Plus, you still have a military salary to take. There's really no need for you to take on any private jobs. In the middle of an important mission for the Experimental Federation's new generation of MX-type mecha, the combat supervisor of Team 7 beside him actually dared to take on private jobs. He didn't know whether to say that this delicate man valued money more than his life, or that he was too filial. This has nothing to do with filial piety. By Magnolia said coldly, I just like money. I also want to live the best life. I want to wear branded clothes, drive branded sports cars, and sleep with the best women. All of this needs money. Sulu was silent. He really didn't know what kind of person By Magnolia was. At this time a nurse walked over. Seeing Sulu smoking, she loudly reprimanded him. Sulu stood up unabashedly and apologized profusely. He extinguished the cigarette with the tip of his foot. Unable to find the dustbin, he could only pinch the cigarette between his fingers. By Magnolia looked quietly at his fingertips. Looking at the extinguished cigarette, he suddenly said, What exactly do you want me to do? Sulu took out a bank card from his pocket. It was the one Li Xiaotong had prepared for him. Handing it over, he said, There's 20 million in the card. By Magnolia was silent for a long time. He was probably shocked by this number. He could be considered a high-income person in the Federation. Adding in the private jobs he had taken on over the years and the 1.2 million check Sulu had given him in the afternoon, he had about 5 million in savings. However, his attitude towards money had always been extremely respectful. The more the better. He took the light yet heavy bank card and said calmly, Deal. By Magnolia didn't ask Sulu what he wanted him to do. For a moment, Sulu didn't understand what deal meant. Only after a long while did he come to his senses. His eyes gradually narrowed. He understood that this oddly delicate man was saying that he would sell his life to him. Chapter 206. Sulu used to be very poor. In the first 2 years after he became an orphan, he only ate with Xiao Chong's mother for 2 years. Because of some unknown reason, perhaps because of his innate self-esteem or inferiority complex, he moved out and applied for government aid. He officially joined Li Wei's group of orphans to shop on the streets. He learned a lot from Uncle Fengyu, but that stingy boss did not have the habit of giving him a salary. He only left behind a bank card after his death. It was from that bank card that Sulu could be considered to have stepped into the stage of a rich person. His poor childhood did not distort his concept of money. Instead, he increasingly felt that money was just a tool. It was not a goal to strive for. This was not like a lotus flower growing in the mud, but a rock in Donglin. No matter how long it soaked in the latrine, would still be hard. The stench attached to it would disappear after being washed away by clean water. Because of this concept, the bank card that Uncle Feng left him contained enough money for a normal person to live a normal life. In just a short year he spent almost all of it. He secretly transferred 1 million to Li Wei, who was far away in Donglin, through the black market. He bought a set of antique simulation equipment from the Shell Motor Company, bought some components, bought flowers, porridge, and biscuits for Zhang Xiaoming, and bought pancakes, porridge, and women for Tai Zion. How much was left? After leaving Yue University, he started to receive a salary from the Shell Motor Company. He received the riskiest investment in his life from the Li family's 7th young master. Suddenly, Sulu became a young multimillionaire. Then, he gave away this multimillionaire. Although he did not value money, it did not mean that he did not understand the magic of money in the Federation. That was why he gave the bank card to Bai Yulan. But after that, he realized that he still did not understand Bai Yulan. Could it be that money could really buy a person's life? Ever since the battle at the armory, Bai Magnolia had returned to her usual self. She spoke very little, but she had begun to truly fulfill her duties as a secretary. In fact, she was even better than a full-time secretary. As long as Sulu did not express any objections, she would stand behind him like a shadow and help him deal with all the complicated matters. He was like a secretary but also like a bodyguard. However, Bai Yulan did not have much respect for him. She just treated this as a very boring job. Sulu was not used to Bai Yulan's change, but he had to admit that things were much smoother with Bai Yulan's help. For example, today when Sulu decided to take advantage of the 4-day summer holiday in the Federation to rush to Harbor City, Bai Yulan immediately bought a train ticket that was very popular. The people who were on holiday on the train passed through the self-propelled track on the platform and waved goodbye to their relatives and friends on the upper floors with smiles on their faces. Sulu retracted his gaze from the window and looked at the serene Bai Yulan in front of him. His emotions could not help but become somewhat complicated. Using Li Xiaodong's investment, he had purchased many of the components that Sulu needed. Right now, the simulation system that he had privately modified was gradually becoming a prototype. Besides this important task, Sulu had originally wanted to use the data and functional formulas in his head, as well as the design progress of the Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department. Perhaps he would be able to solve the problem of the new generation of mecha in the Federation one step ahead. However, when he truly began to come into contact with this field, Sulu found that he was just daydreaming. The few prototype mecha that Whitewater Company had been experimenting with in the 100 Mu Triangle star region had long been towed back to the main company. Even if the Nutshell Engineering Department had been continuously providing feedback through Zhouyu, and even if Li Xiaotong had invested 100 times more, there was no way that he could solve this problem on his own. Thus, he decided to make a trip to the Federation. The Nutshell Engineering Department was in the suburbs of the most prosperous city in the Federation, and he brought Bai Yulan with him. Developing a revolutionary new mecha did not only require a breakthrough in engineering. Just like the Nutshell Engineering Department's spring recruitment exam question, the mecha was to serve people. More accurately, it was to serve the pilots of the Federation. During the development process, it required the most experienced pilots of the federal military to carry out continuous experiments. The ace pilots of the federal military were most likely working together in the laboratories of the Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department. Sulu only had Bai Yulan by his side. Fortunately, Bai Yulan had come into contact with this new mecha before, and was familiar with its controls. It was precisely because of this reason that Sulu had given up on the absurd idea of building the new mecha in the Whitewater Company's base. Instead, like a gamble, he had given all his funds to Bai Yulan. However, he did not tell Bai Yulan the truth, because he did not truly understand this delicate man. Quiet as a virgin, gentle and silent. With a flash of the knife, there was a cold murderous intent in her shyness. How could such a person be so interested in the stench of money? This was the most luxurious soft sleeper compartment on the Beijing high-speed railway. Bai Yulan was indeed a person who treated herself well. Even Sulu was able to enjoy the high-class treatment. He did not hide his gaze. He curiously looked at Bai Yulan, who was listening to music with her eyes closed. In the post-interstellar era where crystal mines were gradually depleted, space travel, which was very common in the early days of the constitutional era, began to become extremely expensive and luxurious. In this universe composed of galaxies, not every citizen of the Federation had access to advanced technology such as mechas, battleships, and spaceships. Not everyone could freely travel between the stars. Even the citizens who were born in the two recent constitutional era had never left the planet they belonged to. They just silently worked at their respective posts. Other than watching the real-time images taken by the spaceship on Channel 10, or watching the cute purple-haired colonel on Channel 23 lead the Enterprise through the stars, the most likely way for a normal citizen of the Federation to truly set foot in the universe was to join the military. Or rather, it was to voluntarily sign up for the excavation department of a mining company. They would go to remote resource planets to operate machines that did not speak and spend a long and lonely time there. However, the people of the Federation always had a way to solve these mental needs. Since the constitutional era, high-speed rail transit across the surface of the planet had become the most retro and satisfying form of transportation in the writings of writers. That was why Sulu could see such a busy station. The maximum speed of the high-speed rail had now reached 800 kilometers per hour. There was no problem in using it to maintain the transportation of the entire planet's surface. Although it was still much slower than flying through the clouds, the ticket price was correspondingly much cheaper. Why was the high-speed rail paved with dense magnetic material called the high-speed rail? This was a question that required archaeology. It was said that it was a saying before the catastrophe. Since there was no historical material, no historians were willing to get to the bottom of it. Accompanied by a soft electronic sound, the station and buildings outside the window began to speed up and recede. The radio noise during the startup phase made some passengers who were riding the high-speed rail for the first time find that their portable tablet computer had no wireless signal, and they could not help but complain. Sulu looked at Bai Yulan again, and then looked out of the window again. He looked at the rows of broad-leaved trees in the streets of the capital's special district, which quickly flashed past his eyes. Bai Yulan, who was sitting opposite him, took off her headphones and looked at the young man by the window. As a veteran who had been in the military for 10 years, his gentleness and calmness was not only an effective disguise, but also a way for him to find inner peace. However, looking at Su Li's ordinary face, Bai Yulan's heart was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. The 7th Combat Group of the Whitewater Company, which he led, was now in its most difficult period because of the serious mistake they made in the Bermuda Triangle Star region last autumn. Except for him, the members of the group were either sent back to their respective military districts for confinement or were on unpaid leave. He was the only one who remained at the company headquarters calmly. It was difficult to lead a team when the people's hearts were broken. However, if the people's hearts were still there, and the team was gone, there was no need to say anything. After the fight in the armory, Bai Yulan confirmed that this new young technical director might be a little immature, but he was very scary. He knew that he had held back that day, but the problem was that his opponent must have held back as well. Bai Yulan could not even distinguish Su Li's techniques. She only felt that his close combat style was somewhat similar to a certain technique promoted by the special forces in the military a few years ago, except that it was more direct and more ruthless. In addition to his combat strength, Su Li's performance in the next few days also surprised Bai Yulan. This young technical director used a jaw-dropping speed to repair all the equipment in the 7th Combat Group's armory. He even repaired a few large pieces of equipment that were damaged. When Bai Yulan was at the front lines in the Westwoods, she had seen many excellent mechanical engineers who were treasured by the military officers. However, she had never seen anyone who could discover problems, judge problems, and solve problems faster than Su Lu. The young man opposite her seemed to have a natural instinct for metal-related mechanical equipment. This should be some kind of talent that could not be replicated. Bai Yulan really could not understand. What kind of medicine did those big shots in the Nutshell Mobile headquarters eat wrong? They actually threw such a genius mechanic into their own Team 7. Unlimited potential, full combat strength, and a lot of money. He was generous like an idiot. His background was mysterious but definitely not simple. Working for such a person was actually not a bad choice. It should be known that in the current Federation, it was not so easy to earn money. As Bai Yulan thought about this, she stood up and made a cup of tea for Su Lu. She was an excellent person who did what she was paid. Since she had received 20 million, she did not mind making Su Li's bed and folding his blanket. The high-quality green tea floated gently in the glass and then slowly sank like a spring fog, dyeing the clear water around it. Su Lu turned around and looked at the green tea in the cup. He was slightly stunned. He wondered if Bai Yulan wanted to steal the orderly's job as well. "I'll go to the dining car and bring dinner over," Bai Yulan said softly and then walked out of the room. Su Lu had never been served like this in his life, so it was inevitable that he was not used to it. Bai Yulan walked out of the room and brushed past 2 youthful girls. Her delicate eyebrows furrowed. The 2 girls walked to a private room at the side. One of the girls looked a little lonely. In this spring weather, she was wearing a dull black outfit. "Meow meow, open your mind. The dead cannot be brought back. If Park Ji-ho was still alive, he would not want you to live such a sad life." Chapter 207. Meow Meow Surname Meow. When her close friends or family members call her by her name, they would only think of the 2 words meow in their hearts. She was 20 years old this year. It was the season when meow sprouts were growing and swaying in the spring breeze. However, this bunch of meow sprouts were tall and straight. It was always pleasing and not eye-catching. She was now a student in Linhai University, and her other identity was Park Ji-ho's fiancé. The golden-haired Park Ji-ho, although his life was not smooth sailing, he met his nemesis, Su-lu, and stopped abruptly before he had the time to develop his grand plans. But in terms of luck, he was pretty lucky. Park Ji-ho and Miao Miao were family friends. Back then they worked together in S3 and moved back to S1. According to the old rules, the two families arranged a marriage. Although it was not a terrifying family like the 7 major families, after all it was still a foundation. Park Ji-ho didn't expect to be free to love. Moreover, Miao Miao was a docile and pleasant girl. Most of his thoughts were on his future, so the two got along well. After the tragedy on Hushan Road, Miao Miao, as Park Ji-ho's fiancé, naturally went to the capital's special district. The funeral had just been arranged a few days ago, but the grief in the girl's heart couldn't be erased in such a short time. The elders of the two families were a little worried, so they simply asked for leave from school. Including the summer vacation, a total of 3 months, they let her go back to her hometown in S3 to relax. Today, in the high-speed train carriage, they were heading to the largest airport in Gongdu. Her fiancé had just passed away, so in this late spring, Miao Miao wore a dull black outfit. Her small face was not powdered, and there was a trace of sadness in her pale face. The girl who was traveling with her was called Nan Xiangmei. She was Miao Miao's good friend. They happened to meet in the special district, so they agreed to go to Gongdu together. His relatives might still be sad, and his fiancé might need to spend several years to get rid of this bad news. However, others didn't have so many thoughts. Although they didn't sing and dance together, Nan Xiangmei had never seen the rumored handsome blonde boy. Therefore, when she saw her female companion's sad expression, it was naturally difficult for her to sympathize with her. She could only quietly comfort her and ease her worries. Nan Xiangmei was definitely not a stunning girl. Her lush black hair was casually cut to the side of her ears. She was not as soft as the average long-haired beauty, nor was she as pretty as the short-haired girls. She was just calm, and her facial features also revealed a sense of calmness. If one looked at her carefully for a long time, one would be able to appreciate more and more of her beauty. Listening to Nan Xiangmei's comfort, Miao Miao forced a smile, but when she thought of her fiancé in the cemetery, her heart couldn't help but twitch. She and Park Ji-gao didn't meet much, but the two of them had the same thoughts. She knew what kind of lofty ambition the blonde man had. Unexpectedly, after 3 months he passed away just like that. Miao Miao didn't know about Nan Xiangmei's family situation. At this age, no one would talk about their family background, but she knew that her friend's family shouldn't be short of money. And at this time she was lonely and sad, so she was grateful to have her friend by her side to comfort her. Miao Miao looked at Nan Xiangmei's calm eyes. After hesitating for a moment, she remembered the news that her sister-in-law secretly told her. That news had been suppressed in her heart, and there was no one to ask. Now that she was comforted by her friend, the sadness and anger in her heart suddenly rushed out. She tightly pursed her lips and said, "There is a secret behind Jigao's death. Didn't the district prosecutor's office close the case?" Nan Xiangmei was slightly surprised. She looked at her and said softly, "It's just a scapegoat." Miao Miao's face showed a trace of sadness. Jigao offended a big shot in the Federation, so he was killed. Nan Xiangmei quietly looked at her eyebrows and confirmed that her friend didn't start talking nonsense because of the death of her fiancé. She tilted her head and thought for a moment, then said, "Who told you?" "Park Ji-sung. The elders in the family were worried that I would think too much, so they kept it from me." Miao Miao sadly turned her head and looked at the mountains outside the car window that was covered with a layer of golden sunset. She thought that the sun would eventually rise tomorrow, but what about her lover? Nan Xiangmei softly sighed. After a moment of consideration, she was sure that it was inappropriate for her to say anything at this time. She had no choice but to ask, "Who is so vicious?" "I heard that it was a person who entered the nutshell with Jigao. He entered the research institute, but then disappeared." Miao Miao turned her head and sneered, but Yulan shrugged. She carried the tray through the passage and opened the door of the private room. She thought that the sound insulation of the luxurious soft-sleeper private room on the high-speed rail was too poor. The two girls inside actually didn't know who to avoid when they talked about murder and arson. The luxurious soft-sleeper private room occupied a large area. In addition to 2 comfortable beds, there was also a sofa and a few simple furnishings. Bai Yulan put the tray on the coffee table. She glanced at the big black box under the coffee table and looked at Sulu. Sulu nodded. Bai Yulan opened the big black box and pushed it under Suli's bed. When they left the capital, Sulu always carried this big box with him. He didn't know what was in the box, but he knew that it was very heavy. She poured a glass of orange juice for Sulu. Sulu said thank you. Then the 2 people couldn't find anything to talk about and began to eat in silence. After the meal, Bai Yulan began to clean up the mess again. Sulu was bored to death as she watched this delicate man busying himself in and out. For a moment, she couldn't help but have an illusion that she had spent 20 million yuan to buy a maid. How long will it take to get to Hong Kong? Sulu watched the TV for a while and suddenly asked. Just now the broadcast said that there was a flash flood along the New Yuezhou. Although it didn't affect the line, it is estimated that it will take about 10 hours to get there because of the Federation's disaster relief train. Bai Yulan softly replied. Sulu shook his head. The summer holiday was only 4 days. He had to secretly enter the Nutshell Engineering Department, so he could only use the holiday. Time was a little tight. If he didn't worry that the big black leather suitcase wouldn't pass the Federation's airport security check, he would never take the high-speed train. According to Bai Yulan, the luxury soft sleeper ticket was actually much more expensive than the plane ticket. Go 1 carriage in the A direction, there is a special bar. Bai Yulan said. Oh, since we have nothing to do, let's go walk around? Sulu asked for his opinion. Bai Yulan had finished cleaning up and quietly replied. I don't have any opinion, but I want to remind you of one thing. Park Ji-ho's fiancé lives next door. Sulu was stunned. He looked at Bai Yulan and gradually narrowed his eyes. The Hushan Road incident happened a long time ago. He knew that there were probably not many people in the Whitewater Company who knew about his relationship with that incident. Since Secretary Bai reminded him, he must know the inside story very well. How did he know? I have to find out who I am working for. Bai Yulan lowered his eyes and said softly, Don't worry, as long as you don't violate the Federation's laws. I don't care if you are the son-in-law of the Deputy Minister of National Defense. I only care about money. Since he knew that Park Ji-ho's fiancé was on the train and lived next door, Sulu certainly wouldn't go to the bar to kill time. Although he did have a hobby of drinking now, if he really met a widow who was drowning her sorrows in alcohol, he really didn't know what would happen. After all, that widow's fiancé was killed by him. Sulu didn't have any psychological burden when he killed Park Ji-ho. Even the Hushan Road incident was just a matter of seconds. However, he didn't want to meet the relatives of the deceased. When he was spat on by Park Ji-ho's younger sister in the district prosecutor's office, although it didn't dry up, he didn't feel angry. He just silently wiped it away. Park Ji-ho's fiancé probably didn't know him, let alone know that he killed Park Ji-ho. However, Sulu didn't take the risk. It wasn't until late at night that he walked out of the compartment and walked to the lounge at the end of the train. He sat on the sofa in the corner and looked at the whistling night outside the window. The curved and decelerating glass windows made the scenery outside clear but not dazzling. The air noise caused by the high-speed train was also reduced to a minimum. He lit a cigarette and thought about the girl who was not far from him. He thought about Park Ji-ho's stunned and desperate expression under the knife at Hushan Road. He frowned slightly. In the dim light, a girl walked over and sat on the sofa not far from Sulu. Smoking was allowed in the lounge. 3 single sofas were placed in a triangle. The designer probably meant that there were only 3 luxurious sofa compartments on the train. Sulu, who was sitting in the corner, saw the girl coming and thought about what he had been thinking. The cigarette in his hand trembled, and the ashes fell on his knees. He looked a little embarrassed. He hurriedly tried to put out the cigarette. No, my family often smokes. I'm used to the smell. Nan Xiangmei looked at the young man in the corner with a smile. She didn't secretly guess the identity of the other party. Although it was strange that the other party was staying in a luxurious compartment at such a young age, it was just that she misunderstood Su Li's action of putting out the cigarette. She somewhat approved of this person's attentiveness and didn't want to be nosy. She was not used to riding in such a luxurious compartment. Although her family definitely didn't care about the cost, she only came here to accompany her friend. The sleeping compartment at night didn't shake much, but she was still more used to riding the old-fashioned train alone in her early years. That kind of shaking felt real. The lounge was very dim at night. After Sulu heard the girl's words, he silently took back his hand that was putting out the cigarette. Looking at the calm smile on the girl's face, Sulu knew that the other party should not be the widow that he didn't want to see. His mood was slightly relieved. People who met by chance on the journey might strike up a conversation or remain silent. At this time, the man and woman on the sofa were silent. The dim light didn't mean that it was ambiguous. The corner was darker. Sulu quietly looked at the girl. The girl was wearing a plain dress, and her whole body exuded a sense of peace. At first, he didn't feel anything, but the more he looked at her, the more he could see the beauty of her face under her black hair. When he was in Donglin, he liked to look at the few beauties on the street. When he was a gatekeeper, he also saw many youthful bodies. With just a few glances, he found that this girl was outstanding. Chapter 208. The girl not far in front of him had a beautiful face. Her black hair gently covered her ears. There was a trace of calmness that could not be disturbed. It was pleasing to the eye, but it was only pleasing to the eye. Sulu may not have reached the age where he could truly appreciate the beauty of the opposite sex, but he could feel that the other party was outstanding. However, this kind of excellence had nothing to do with him. His current state of mind had really been beyond the word lust for a long time. Previously, when he was nestled in the corner of the sofa, thinking about the widow on the other side of the wall, the reason why he silently smoked was because he remembered the state of mind when he learned of Zhang Xiaoming's death. Vaguely, he could roughly understand the pain of Park Ji-ho's fiancée at this time. Under certain circumstances, the joys and sorrows of human beings should be interconnected. Young people's first love encountered the most unbearable encounter in the world. Sulu was young, but as Li Xiaotong once said, there was a trace of loneliness in the old house. Love gradually drifted away from him. After several trips with Li Xiaotong and seeing the flattering attitude of the young stars, he did not even have the mood to play along. To get rid of this state of mind, he needed time, or another girl who could enter his heart. The light was dim, and the sound outside the window was light. The beautiful girl sat quietly beside him. Unfortunately, it was not that time, so Sulu just kept silent. After an unknown period of time, the train suddenly slowed down. Sulu woke up from his half-awake state and subconsciously looked out of the window. He saw a large area of lights in the distance of the plain. It should be a big city. He immediately thought that this should be the only stop on the way of the Beijing High-Speed Railway, the capital of South Kazhou. At this time, Nan Xiangmei, who was sitting in front of him on the sofa, was also awakened from her slight tiredness. She looked out of the window. Their eyes met on the glass that reflected the scene inside the carriage. At the same time, they were stunned. Nan Xiangmei rubbed the slightly curled thick black hair below her ear and smiled at Sulu on the glass. Sulu smiled and nodded but still did not say anything. Sulu felt for the cigarettes in his pocket and put the box on the coffee table. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and took a deep breath. He didn't know if it was because he clearly felt that the beautiful girl next to him was staring at him, but he actually didn't know what to do and coughed twice. Nan Xiangmei looked at him curiously. The two of them had been sitting in silence for at least an hour. They didn't say a word, but there was always some lingering curiosity. Especially at this time, the coughing sounds in the quiet car were so clear. Her pair of clear eyes overflowed with concern. Sulu was a little embarrassed. He felt that it was not appropriate to stay here any longer. He reached for the cigarette box and prepared to leave. At this moment, the carriage stopped at the platform and the door opened. There should be passengers boarding the carriage. Sulu was slightly surprised and turned his gaze to the corridor. There were only 3 luxurious soft sleeper compartments in this carriage. He and Bai Yulan occupied one. Park Ji-ho's fiancée and the beautiful girl in front of him, who he didn't know the name of, occupied the other one. The other one had been empty. But the problem was that it was only a few hours away from Harbor City. Could there be people coming on the way? While he was stunned, the uninvited guests had already passed through the corridor and directly came to the lounge. The 3 sofas occupied a large space. Sulu wanted to go out at this time, but it was not convenient. Bai Yulan suddenly came to the corridor and stepped on the side of the carriage. She slightly lowered her head and was as quiet as usual. Seeing Bai Yulan suddenly appear, and then seeing the two people in front of him, Su Li's heart slightly moved. He withdrew his hand from the cigarette box and carefully hid behind the sofa, hiding his face in the darkness. Generally speaking, it was used to describe a spring breeze, or a little girl who missed her brother, or a little girl who only met 3 months ago. It was rarely used to describe two big men. However, the two passengers who had boarded midway gave Su Lu, who was sitting on the sofa, a strong feeling. He even felt that if these two passengers were willing, they could carry the cold wind of winter in Linhai. Although there were only 2 people, the footsteps that seemed to trample on people's hearts were like thousands of soldiers and horses marching over. Among the 2 people, the one who walked in front was about 30 years old. His facial features were ordinary, but there was a sense of grace in his calm eyes. His shoulders were straight, but because of the gray coat, there was a sense of steepness. Under the guidance of the train attendant, this person did not enter his compartment, but went directly to the lounge. He walked so naturally that if he wanted to, everything in front of him should make way for him. When this man walked past Bai Yulan, he did not even look at her. Walking behind this man was a big man. He was 1.9 meters tall and was not far from the ceiling of the carriage. He had a shiny bald head, and a tattoo drilled out from his back, spreading along his neck to the back of his head. Under the dim light, it was impossible to see what the tattoo was, but it was probably a somewhat ferocious flower in full bloom. He was supposed to be an extremely oppressive man, but behind the 30-year-old man in front of him, he deliberately restrained his aura and tried to be as calm as possible. But when he followed the man through the corridor and passed by Bai Yulan, he inconspicuously turned his head to look at the delicate man. Bai Yulan still had her head lowered, as if she did not feel anything, but her right foot that was pressing against the wall of the carriage slid down a few inches. Su Lu had a natural instinct for danger. Although the 2 men in the car didn't show any malicious intent, he could feel that they were strong. He didn't know what kind of strength they were referring to, but seeing Bai Yulan, who was sleeping in the private room, quietly come to his side, it was enough to prove something. The ordinary-looking man sat on the only empty sofa in the lounge, and the bald tattooed man naturally stood behind him. The train slowly moved away from the capital of South Kazhou. The waiter saw that the distinguished guests in the luxurious compartment did not seem to be sleepy, so he resisted the tiredness and politely served them a few cups of tea and 2 plates of snacks. The man was sitting on the sofa in a relaxed manner. He did not drink tea, but looked at the pack of cigarettes on the coffee table. Suddenly, he leaned over and picked it up, saying, "Good cigarettes, can I have one?" "You're welcome." The man's voice was not magical, but it was low and gentle, and somewhat pleasant to the ears. Su Lu said, and at the same time handed over a lighter. Nan Xiangmei had been sitting quietly on the sofa. She really did not want to spend the night in that luxurious compartment like a luxury hotel. Previously, when she saw that the passenger who got on the train went directly to the lounge, she thought that he was someone Su Lu knew, but now she knew that she was wrong. She could not help but look at Su Lu in confusion. For some reason, Su Lu seemed to be able to understand the meaning of this beautiful girl, and he shook his head with a bitter smile. At this time, the sofa in the lounge was full. A bald tattooed man with a height of 1.9 meters was standing behind the man like a bodyguard. The delicate secretary was resting with her eyes closed in the corridor next to the lounge. The scene was somewhat strange. Nan Xiangmei also noticed this. She stood up, politely nodded to Su Lu, and was ready to go back to the room to rest. The unknown man sitting on the sofa suddenly smiled and said, "Miss Nan Xiangmei, I specially came to see you. Would you do me the honor of saying a few words?" Nan Xiangmei looked at the man seriously and curiously. She had to admit that although this man was obviously over 30 years old, he was not handsome, but his temperament was really attractive. What made her unable to leave immediately was that this man actually called her name. Did he really come here to see her? Su Lu, who was sitting in the corner, heard the words Miss Nan Xiangmei, and his heart couldn't help but tremble. Nan Xiangmei was a somewhat strange surname, but there were many people with this surname in the Federation. But the problem was that there were not many Miss Nan Xiangmei who could afford to live in a luxurious soft sleeper compartment. For Miss Nan Xiangmei to be specially visited by this man, There was only one possibility. One of the 7 major families in the Federation, the Nanxiangmei family. In the dim light, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Su Li's face. Unexpectedly, he could meet the miss of the Nanxiangmei family on a casual trip. It seemed that he, an insignificant person, was really at odds with one of the 7 major families in the Federation. After a moment of daze, he was more interested in why the middle-aged man sitting on the sofa, who was obviously not an ordinary person, would choose to visit a beautiful girl who was so peaceful that no one could bear to disturb her in the middle of the night in a high-speed car. "Excuse me, who are you?" Nanxiangmei looked curiously at the man on the sofa, as if he was not worried about her safety at all. I was familiar with Nanxiangshu in the past. When Nanxiangmei heard this, she felt relieved. The Nanxiang family had a very strict upbringing. Apart from true friends, very few people would know their real names. Since the other party could call out her brother's real name, he shouldn't be lying. "I have always heard that Miss Nanxiangmei is a very outstanding woman." The man on the sofa looked at Nanxiangmei gently. There was no superfluous emotion in his eyes, only endless admiration and pity. "Seeing you today, it is indeed so." Upon hearing this, Nanxiangmei couldn't help but blush. She wasn't a person who was easily embarrassed, but for some reason, the praise from the man on the sofa was like the verdict of a certain professor in the Federation, giving the listener endless confidence. Am I really an outstanding woman? Thinking of this, she could not help but feel a little shy. Sulu looked at the dark red color under Nanxiangmei's white earlobes and could not help but be slightly startled. "Dohai is not good enough for you," the man on the sofa suddenly said seriously. "This marriage is called off." Hearing this sentence, Nanxiangmei was shocked and immediately guessed the real identity of the man on the sofa. Among the 7 great families hidden in the shadows of the Federation, marriage was a very common thing. Once the parents of both sides decided, no one could stop it. Nanxiangmei also could not escape this fate. However, at this moment, a strange man suddenly got on the train in the middle of the night, praised her with full of pity, and said that he wanted to call off the marriage. Among the 7 great families, probably only this person could ignore the authority of the elders and break the marriage between the 2 families with just a sentence. Nanxiangmei slowly stood up with a trace of disbelief and looked at the man on the sofa in a daze. In the hearts of the children of the aristocratic families, this man in front of her was already a legend, and deeply respected. "Thank you." Sulu was an outsider. He did not know Nanxiangmei, and it was impossible for him to know who the man on the sofa was. So, he did not understand this conversation at all. He only felt that Miss Nanxiangmei, who was silent in the middle of the night, seemed to be happy from the bottom of her heart. Chapter 209. He looked down and was about to speak, but the man on the sofa just smiled, then stood up and whispered to the extremely burly man behind him, "You can go now." The man lowered his head slightly. The dim light reflected on his bald head, making the lounge seem a little brighter. At this moment, Sulu saw the face of the mysterious man clearly. He was indeed an ordinary person wearing a light gray shirt. There was nothing special about him, but he gave people a feeling of a river. Although the words "you can go now" were said very softly, it fell into the ears of the people in the lounge. Sulu was slightly surprised. He didn't understand where the other party was going. Judging from his tone, he didn't mean to rest in the compartment. But at this time the train was moving at a speed of 800 kilometers per hour. Where could he go? Even the slightly bowed bald man didn't seem to expect that the man would say to go now, but he was slightly startled, nodded, and walked to the aisle next to the lounge, turned the wrench, and put his hand on the emergency brake device. The emergency brake device of the high-speed train was strictly prohibited from being pulled at will. There were obvious warning words on it, and there was a conspicuous red sign painted on it, but the tattooed bald man just turned it on naturally. He didn't care about the warning at all. Sulu immediately understood what these 2 people were going to do. For a moment he didn't know how many absurd feelings surged in his heart. He stared in disbelief at that place. That steady and strong hand pulled with all its might, only to hear the rapid alarm sound. The harsh sound of the emergency brake penetrated the thick glass, piercing everyone's ears. The high-speed dense magnetic track carriage instantly slowed down. A huge braking force was transmitted from the carriage to everyone's body. Nan Xiangmei, who was standing with a confused face, didn't know what happened until now. She was hit by the braking force. For a moment, she lost her balance and fell forward. Su Li's pupils shrank. He stared at the two arrogant men who didn't care about all the rules in the world, but he didn't stop them. He just tightly held both sides of the sofa to stabilize himself. At this time he felt a fragrance in his arms. He subconsciously reached out to support Nan Xiangmei's body, his hand on the girl's waist, but he still couldn't stop Nan Xiangmei from falling into his arms, warm and tender. The ear-piercing breaking sound finally stopped. The train was like a wounded serpent. After a long time, horrified shouts, loud curses and low cries came from the other carriages. There were only 3 rooms in the luxurious room, so it wasn't as noisy as the other rooms. However, the expressions on their faces were a little ugly. Nan Xiangmei finally woke up from her panic. She supported herself on Su Li's shoulder and stood up. She hurriedly bowed her head and thanked him. Then she lowered her head and walked towards the room. At the door of the room, she found that Miao Miao was waking up with sleepy eyes. No matter how deeply asleep a person was, they would still be affected by the sudden braking force. He woke up with a start. Sulu subconsciously looked towards the corridor, and saw that Magnolia was still standing quietly by the window. However, her feet were already on the floor, and her face was slightly pale. He didn't know what she was thinking. The man on the sofa was gone, and so was the bald man with a ferocious flower tattoo. There was no one in the lounge, as if the two people had never been there. Sulu quickly turned back and looked out of the window. At this time the lights in the carriage were turned on, illuminating the field around the magnetic track. This place should still be in the territory of South Kazhou. The Federation's unified farm was densely planted in the fields. There were about 1 person planting a variety of grains. Under the night wind and the illumination of the train lights, the grains undulated like waves. Sulu narrowed his eyes. He vaguely saw 2 figures in the waves of the grains, quietly moving towards the distance. The bald man silently followed the man in gray clothes through the difficult fields of the farm grains. He startled the voles and disturbed the insects. He was silent, without any doubts or questions. Gradually, they went farther and farther until they came to a small hill beside the field. The man in front stopped and looked back at the distant magnetic track with faint lights. He smiled. The man sat down and took out a flat metal bottle from his pocket. He took a small sip and then handed it behind him. The bald man also sat down beside him. He took the bottle and took a big gulp. After a moment of silence he said, "I thought you would at least say a few words to that guy called Sulu." The man smiled and said softly, "Sometimes a glance is enough to see a person. There's no need to say anything." For a man who left home at a young age and was extremely rebellious, he had honed his strength to match this kind of rebellion. He had built such a large territory with his bare hands. Other than the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation, there were no rules in the Federation that were worthy of his attention. He had boarded the train in the middle of the night from South Kazhou just to see the man and woman. Since he had seen them, he was satisfied and naturally left. He came in high spirits and returned in high spirits. He did what he wanted. When he wanted to leave a certain place, he didn't want to stay for even a second. When he said he would leave without hesitation. As for the inconvenience and commotion that his jaw-dropping way of leaving would bring to the people on the train, it wasn't something he cared about. The thorny flower Baldy silently sipped his wine. He usually drank 3 caddies of white wine, but the man beside him only had a small bottle on him. He drank it very carefully. Although he drank it in small sips, after a few sips, there wasn't a single drop left in the bottle. He turned his head to look at the man in front of him who was gnawing on a green plant. He knew that this man had always been used to doing as he pleased. But tonight he still didn't understand why he wanted to see that young man called Sulu. If the young lady of the Southern Prime Minister's family was involved in the man's younger brother's marriage, then what did Sulu represent? That little guy called Sulu, it seems that he still doesn't know what happened in S2 tonight. The man peeled off the outer layer of the green plant on his finger, and sucked on the fragrant juice inside. He said in a muffled voice, "Once this matter is out, Lawyer Pabre will be in a terrible fix for a while. That old bastard Macklin will definitely cry in front of the Federation voters again. The hearts of the people can't be used up. Ross is also a smart person. He allowed Macklin to play as he pleased. The two of them took advantage of the situation and narrowed the gap between them a little. The thorny flower Baldy's expression calmed down. Although the activities of the upper echelons of the Federation and the circle of the Jianghu he belonged to were thousands of miles apart, he knew that the man beside him would never say anything meaningless. The Federation election is just a show. It's not a foreplay but a climax that girls envy. Wave after wave there will always be a break in between. Tonight's terrorist attack at the concert can be considered as a climax. The next climax will naturally be the development of the new Mecca of the Federation. There are still at least a few months in between. Logically speaking, the data from the laboratory should be in the hands of those hypocrites from the Federal Academy of Science. However, the Nutshell Engineering Department has never let go of it. Moreover, Sulu is currently heading to Hong Kong. This is somewhat interesting. The thorny flower Baldy had been silent the entire time. He believed that this matter had nothing to do with him or the man beside him who he respected so much. In my entire life, other than the first 2 years of recklessness, I have always been looking at those interesting people and things in the Federation. The man threw away the green plant in his hand and smiled as he looked up at the stars in the night sky. He said, Nan Xiangmei is a very outstanding girl. How can a fool like Do Hai be worthy of her? Sulu is also a very interesting person. I believe that he is also very clear about his own importance. The problem is that he doesn't show it. The one I don't understand the most is that old ghost, Macklin. He is the second leader of the anti-government army. He forcefully entered the political system of the Federation through non-violence. He completely broke away from the armed forces and even wants to be the vice president. The problem is that with his intelligence, how can he not understand that the anti-government army in the mountains is his most solid foundation? If the anti-government army is really turned into a pack of dogs by him, he can only be a forgotten character in the Federation. Even if he really becomes the vice president in the future, he will only be a puppet. Moreover, the moves he used are too ruthless and too insidious. They are completely pushing the Federation down the path of chaos. What good does this do for him? If he is from the Empire, it would be easy to understand. The problem is that this old man is definitely not from the Empire. He is also an extremely strong fanatic. He smiled slightly and took back the bottle from the Baldy's hand. He found that it was already empty, so he couldn't help but shake his head. He took out a pack of cigarettes from his arms and gave one to the Baldy and lit one for himself. It was the pack of 37 brand cigarettes that he took out in the carriage. The Baldy squatted beside him and took a deep breath of the cigarette. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the man's side profile. Many people in the Federation were proud of his evaluation, but only he knew that the man beside him was truly famous for his unique vision. That pair of eyes that were praised by people for being able to appreciate beauty in the universe. Even the family that the man betrayed still needed his judgment from time to time. This was a rare opportunity, so the Baldy asked in a deep voice, "What do you think of the people involved in this matter?" Li Xiaozhu is only a bag of skin. When the man evaluated the young people of the 7 great families in the Federation, he actually had a sense of superiority. He said lightly, on the contrary, the Li family's old 7 is much more outstanding than him. Those old men of the Li family are also blind. Make money, make money. It's good to have money. What good does it do to get involved in this matter? However, that brat Li Xiaotong isn't really smart. If he didn't want to get involved, then he shouldn't be so close to Sulu. The topic turned back to Sulu. Tonight he boarded the car to look at people. This man was mainly looking at Sulu. He was very curious about the young man who could fight Madman Li to a draw in his own shop. Other people in the Federation might not care about the fighting ability of these people, but this man was very clear about the terror of the Lees of Philadelphia. As for people like Minister Zhou's Tai family, he didn't want to pay attention to them. In fact, he didn't even care about the presidential election. He had already left that circle and had never thought about going back. He was disdainful to go out. In life he wanted to be happy and do as he pleased. Therefore, he always only cared about the men or women he was interested in. What do you think of that young man? The bald man was silent for a long time before he said, Looking at his behavior a while ago, he does have some of my subordinates' fierceness. But looking at him today, he seems a little lifeless. This kind of temperament is either hiding a ball of fire in his chest, waiting to explode, or he is really an ignorant stone, waiting to be washed away by the water until it becomes round and boring. The man smiled. He had always admired his subordinate's insight. After a moment of silence, he sighed and said, "Money can't buy youth. Now, I have always wanted to find the freedom I had when I broke the door, but after all, I am not that age anymore. This brat is so young and capable, but he is so restrained. It's really a pity. Being too young and not frivolous may be good for his future, but this kind of life is too boring." However, the delicate man next to him is quite interesting. Do you know who he is? It should be his secretary Bai Yulan. Since they wanted to find out what train Sulu was on, the bald man naturally did some work. He said with a smile, "Under the feminine appearance, there is a poisonous snake hiding. He can be considered a character. There are many hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the Federation, not to mention in a gloomy place like Whitewater. I am just a little curious. How did a boring young man like Sulu manage to subdue such a character?" The bald man smiled bitterly and looked at the vast wilderness under the hill, where there was no road in front of them and no airport behind them. He said, "I am just curious. Are we going to walk back to Nank?" Sulu lowered his head and drank the water in the cup. He felt that there was no taste in his mouth. Previously, the emergency brake had caused the cup in the luxury box to fall to the ground, and many places were wet. At this time, Bai Yulan was silently cleaning up. The patrol on the high-speed train had already been here before. This kind of vicious incident caused a commotion, so naturally they needed a reason to quell it. The fingerprints on the emergency brake had been sampled. Sulu and Nan Xiangmei were both interviewed for a few minutes before the train started again. They didn't have to wait for a long time to solve the case. Sulu looked at the dark wilderness outside the window, and couldn't help but think of the back of the two people in the waves that were taller than a person's head. Using this kind of method to leave was not only elegant but also arrogant. Sulu should be against this kind of behavior from the bottom of his heart, but he didn't know why. But when he thought of the style of the two people, there was a trace of yearning and desire. At this time, Bai Yulan had finished cleaning up the carriage and sat back in front of him. She was quiet and didn't say a word. Sulu looked at her and couldn't help but ask, "I don't know the identity of the two people just now." The 20 million had already been accepted. Bai Yulan played the role of a personal secretary perfectly. She replied softly, "He's a powerful character." This was nonsense. Although Sulu didn't have the urge to take back the 20 million, he was still a little unhappy and lowered his head. "I only know the bald guy with the flower tattoo." Bai Yulan lowered his eyes and took out a small knife from his trouser pocket with his right hand and calmly placed it beside him. When the two men got on the train, he had been keeping his hand in his trouser pocket. His fingers might have been holding this delicate knife all the time. Bai Yulan was a delicate man, and the weapon he used was also very delicate. It was naturally inconvenient to use a military knife outside, so he changed to a small knife, but still looked delicate. But just like him, the delicate appearance was just a means to hide the terrifying coldness. At the mention of the man with the ferocious flower tattoo, the delicate man's face turned slightly pale. He wasn't nervous but rather excited. However, his voice was still extremely soft and gentle. "I'm the one who takes on all of Team 7's private jobs. The company also often takes on some shady missions, so I do know a little about these reckless people in the Federation." Sulu raised his head and looked at him with some surprise. He was just asking casually, but he didn't expect Bai Yulan to really recognize the man. The big man with the flower tattoo is called Zhang Xiaohua. Bai Yulan pinched the delicate knife between her two fingers and carefully trimmed her nails. She lowered her head and said, "Don't be fooled by his old-fashioned and stingy name. He's actually a very magnanimous person. All the underground businesses in South Kazhou are under his control. Most people call him Uncle Hua. Don't be fooled by his appearance. The big guy is actually very wise. In fact, this Uncle Hua of South Kazhou is as meticulous as his name suggests. You must know that there is no future in the underworld of the Federation. Regardless of whether guns are banned or not, as long as the Constitution exists, as long as the government doesn't like it, They can casually kill these reckless people. But this Uncle Hua is still alive and he is living a good life. Just this point alone is enough to make people admire him. Sulu heard this and nodded. He remembered when he was young, the underworld of Heshi State was defeated and disbanded because of the government. They retreated to the orphans behind Zhonglo Street, which indirectly led to his first killing. The Federation doesn't allow vicious cases to happen, and law and order have been good for countless years. The underworld does not seem to have a future. When this Uncle Hua started his career at the beginning of the year, he had a murder case. I don't know where his luck came from, but he actually found a boat and hid in Bermuda for a few years. Then, for some reason, he returned to the Federation and turned himself in. For some reason, the district court was lenient. In total, he only spent 7 years in prison. How old is Uncle Hua now? Should be 43. Normally, Sulu would ask Bai Yulan at this time. If he were to face Uncle Hua head-on, he would probably have a chance of winning. However, Sulu had never been very curious in this aspect, and he didn't think that he would meet Uncle Hua in the future, so he didn't ask. Bai Yulan had finished trimming her nails and sheathed her knife. She lowered her head and calmly said, "I'm probably not his match, but if he wants to kill me, he will have to shed at least 3 pounds of blood." Sulu was slightly startled, but then he thought that if the bald man named Zhang Xiaohua was such a sharp character, then what kind of character would that 30-year-old man be? Chapter 210. Why did the whistle of the 37th constitutional era make a whistling sound? The Harbor City Tourism Bureau wanted to add a retro style to the high-speed rail. It was said that this was a political achievement that Governor Ross was very proud of. Didn't anyone say that the passageways and huts that were deliberately painted in the color of logs were ugly? Harbor City was the largest and most prosperous city in the Federation. The early morning wind blew through the wide streets, the towering buildings, the dense viaducts and light rail, and the sleepy young men and women. Where did they come from? From the absurdity of the night? If it was nighttime, what kind of lights would this huge city shine under the clouds? Would it be like a monster? At this time, the cement and glass intertwined, which already gave people pressure. If it was dark at night, would it make people want to vomit? Desire? People lived according to the arrangement of desire, especially in this city called Harbor City. He thought of those young men and women with heavy makeup. Their day was a dream, and their night was absurd. Why could the air of this city faintly smell the disgusting smell of bodily fluids? He thought of vomiting again. Sulu pulled the heavy black box and stood silently at the entrance of the Harbor City high-speed rail station. The exit was on the lower floor of the station's giant dome building. Facing the big lake of Harbor City was the famous Federation. The lake water in the early morning didn't have a trace of freshness. It was only warm to the point that it made people feel a little wet. Sang Lake, the largest lake in the city among the 3 major regions of the Federation and several galaxies. Across the slightly foggy lake, a large number of densely packed high-rise buildings symbolizing wealth and status could be seen. The distance between those buildings was so close that they actually blocked the rising sun from the east, making this bustling city inexplicably reveal a trace of gloomy feeling. What a shitty place. It was the first time that Sulu came to the most famous harbor city in the Federation, but he didn't have the slightest excitement. He lowered his head and softly cursed. He pulled the box and walked outside. Bai Yulan, who was not far behind him, silently looked at his back and followed him. Bai Yulan knew that Sulu was not in a good mood. In fact, that quiet and honest face of his seemed to be hiding an uncontrollable anger. But where did this anger come from? In Bai Yulan's heart, Sulu had always been a calm and collected young man who was used to facing everything with a cheerful smile. There had been no problems during the journey last night as well, so why did his mood suddenly change so much? It was definitely not because of the 2 men who got on the bus halfway, nor was it because of the young lady of the South Prime Minister's family. It also had nothing to do with Park Ji-ho's widow. So where did this sudden change in mood come from? Bai Yulan furrowed her eyebrows as she watched Suli's back. She thought of the images in the morning news and vaguely understood. However, she didn't understand why that piece of news in District S2 would change Sulu from a quiet and self-contained young man into a young man who would become incomparably enraged by anything he saw, gradually becoming bitter and unkind. The taxi came and Su Lu and Bai Yulan got on. The taxi drove for more than 40 minutes, but they still only passed through a very small area of Harbor City. The car passed through these streets and alleys and overpasses. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the unfamiliar city streets outside the window. His expression gradually calmed down, but the trace of irritation hidden in his eyes would never stop. From time to time, the sound of emergency news on the big screen on the street would spread into the taxi. The current death toll is more than 300 people. As the rescue work continues, the death toll may rise to an unbearable number. A reporter from the Federation News Channel said in a trembling voice, "No organization or individual has taken responsibility for this terrorist attack." 7 staff members of Senator Medellin's office were killed in this terrorist attack. The senator himself was not seriously injured. The Bureau of Proclamation has classified this incident as a second-order criminal case. The president's office has confirmed that all the attackers are dead. Their identities and past records are being confirmed. A concert called Peace turned into a massacre in the end. What does this mean? The peace process of the Federation is covered with a shadow at this moment. The taxi stopped at the Peninsula Hotel booked in advance. The most luxurious 5-star hotel in Harbor City did not make Su Li's mood slightly better. He pulled the heavy black suitcase into the elevator and entered the room. Without tipping the waiter, he directly turned on the ultra-thin light screen on the wall. The room on the top floor of the Peninsula Hotel was very expensive and large, including the TV light screen. The gradually lit-up light spots gradually condensed into a clear news picture. In the Civic Stadium of the 4 states in Region S2, the colorful lights and ribbons that were originally arranged for Jian Shuai's peace concert had all turned into ashes and ruins at this time. The cliff smoke had dispersed. The stands in the southeast corner of the stadium, which could accommodate 80,000 people, had all been blown up. However, there was not much blood in the picture. The blood might still be hidden in the dust. In the ruins, the lights of the police and ambulances flashed continuously in the gray sky. The anxious and sad voice of the news reporter seemed incomparably pale at this moment. Last night, at the invitation of the government of the 4 states and Senator Medellin, Jian Shuai held a concert called Peace in Region S2. This concert was not to promote the presidential election of Governor Ross and Senator Medellin, but to repair the emotional scars between the ordinary citizens of the Federation and the people of the 4 states as much as possible. However, a sudden suicide terrorist attack made this scar seem deeper and more bloody. The tragic scenes in the news picture, the moaning of the injured in the ambulances and the hospital, the cold and gradually rising number of casualties, were like cold question marks, asking everyone in the Federation. Su Lu sat up straight on the sofa with his hands on his knees. He silently and attentively watched the scenes in the news. He had not heard the name Jian Shuai for several days. Recently, the TV series on Channel 23 of the Federation had changed to 1 episode a week. It was said that this national idol of the Federation was too busy with her studies. He did not expect to hear news of Jian Shuai again. It was so sudden that it was hard for him to accept. Su Lu was an angry youth. He had always thought that Jian Shuai had saved him in the Linhai State Gymnasium. He owed her a life. The news confirmed that Jian Shuai was still alive, so he was not too worried. The reason for his anger was the innocent casualties in the news picture. The people who had happily welcomed the new future of the Federation had disappeared into the black smoke. The images on the news switched back to the studio from the scene of the S2 mountain ring around the 4 states. In the studio, the middle-aged host was saying something to 2 anti-terrorism experts. Su Lu did not listen to the specific process of the terrorist attack. Under the pressuring of the host, the 2 experts were still unwilling to guess who the mastermind behind the terrorist attack was. The Federation had the terrifying enemy of the Empire, but under the glory of the Constitution within the Federation, the only force that had the ability to avoid the joint surveillance of the Federation military and police, create such a shocking tragedy, and have reason to do this should be the anti-government army. On the last day of last year, Senator Pabre had brought the Federation a New Year's gift that the people had been longing for. The anti-government army and the Federation government had officially reached a reconciliation agreement. Under this background, although the 2 anti-terrorism experts had probably long determined who the mastermind behind the scenes was, They were still cautious and refused to open their mouths. Senator Medellin is about to make an announcement. The middle-aged streamer looked at the camera with a solemn expression and said, "At such a critical moment, we would also like to know what Senator Macklin, as the second leader of the anti-government army who has always insisted on anti-violence, will say to the entire Federation." The news footage switched from the studio back to the scene of District S2. Surrounded by countless reporters and cameras, Senator Macklin, who was wearing a black suit, slowly walked onto the news platform. This legendary politician was affected by the terrorist attack last night, and also suffered some minor injuries. However, on his old and wise face, there was only determination and calmness. In the face of the reporters and the cameras, the old and calm Senator Macklin did not immediately begin to read his announcement. Instead, he slowly looked around. The noise around him gradually subsided. Senator Medellin said with a firm and powerful voice, "This is the most critical moment for the Federation, and also the most dangerous moment. Some people are not willing to give up their position and power, so they use violence to warn us. Some people are not willing to see peace, so they use death to warn us. Some people..." Senator Medellin's old voice paused for a moment, and with a hint of sadness he said, "Were my friends, but after last night they will be my enemies." Senator Medellin looked at the crowd in front of the Parliament building quietly and slowly raised his right hand. "Some people want to use violence and death to warn us, infuriate us, and destroy the current peace situation of the Federation, but we..." His voice became heavier and he said word by word, "If we also use violence and death to respond to them, then what is the difference between us and them? I have 7 friends that I spend time with every day, and they died in this shameless assassination. I also know that 300 people or even more died with them." Senator Medellin's eyes were a little wet, and his old voice sounded very moving in the cold wind of the Parliament building. "In order to kill me, this old man, so many innocent people have died. I feel endless sadness and guilt." Then, his old body bent down and bowed at a 90-degree angle. After a long time, the flashes around him sounded. Sulu quietly watched Senator Medellin's speech on the news. Then he lowered his head, crossed his legs, and buried his head between his knees. He said in a low voice, "Fuck you." Chapter 211. After Bai Yulan gave the waiter a tip, she quietly stood behind the sofa with her hands tucked into her pants. She leaned against the wall with a floral pattern and calmly and indifferently looked at Su Li's back. He had already confirmed that Su Li's anger hidden behind his silence was directed at the terrorist attack last night. But what did the incident in District S2 have to do with this young technical director? Why was he so sensitive and angry? What do you think of this? Su Lu, who was sitting on the sofa, suddenly asked without turning around. Bai Yulan's eyelids drooped slightly as she looked at the tip of her shiny leather shoes. After a moment of silence, she said, "The anti-government forces have already issued an announcement condemning this terrorist attack. Councilman Prabel's office also reacted as soon as possible. Unless the Bureau of Proclamation can trace the dead back to the anti-government army, they will definitely not admit to it. I don't think this was the decision of the anti-government army committee. It should be the work of some young hardliners." Bai Yulan lowered his head and analyzed. Because he was a secretary who received 20 million, he didn't understand what this major incident in the Federation had to do with himself and Su Lu, but he still spoke softly. "It seems that the rumor that there are hardliners in the anti-government army in the mountains who are very dissatisfied with Senator Medellin's capitulation and want to use blood to punish him is true. Next, someone will have to pay the price. Regardless of whether the investigation results are found or not, the president has to give the victims of the attack an explanation." Bai Yulan raised her head, shrugged and said, "If the war starts again, Senator Prabel will suffer the most. The reconciliation agreement reached before the year will become a piece of paper. His biggest political capital in the presidential election will immediately depreciate, and it might even become a debt." This wasn't a very good analysis. Magnolia's delicate appearance hid a fierce fighting ability, but he was not a strategic analyst after all. The experts on the TV news who were bolder because of Senator Macklin's speech also began to analyze the impact of the attack on the concert on the peace process of the entire Federation, as well as the impact of the presidential election that was going to be held in full swing this fall. Sulu lifted his head from between his knees and looked at the news expressionlessly. He knew that there was nothing wrong with Magnolia's analysis. Just like what most people had guessed and thought, no one would think that the mastermind behind this terrorist attack was Senator Macklin. This was because even if Senator Pobre's election was thwarted, Senator Macklin, as the second-in-command of the anti-government forces, would still be viewed with hostility by many of the Federation's voters. Senator Macklin's image in front of the people of the Federation was that of an old man who abided by nonviolence. He had no reason or ability to create such a terrorist attack. None of the citizens of the Federation would doubt the old man, especially after the tearful scene just now. The people who had calmed down even faintly hoped that the peace process of the Federation would not end because of this terrorist attack. Then, who else could lead the negotiations between the government and the 4 provinces in the future other than Senator Medellin, who had 7 of his subordinates tragically killed and himself injured? Although there were tens of millions of people, Sulu watched the news in silence, not believing it. He didn't have any evidence, and he didn't even have the logic to make an inference. He just relied on his intuition and his twisted personality to attribute the responsibility of the attack on the concert in the 4 provinces to Macklin. This was an unreasonable way of thinking. The delicate secretary behind him wouldn't think this way, and the officials wouldn't think this way either. However, Sulu was someone who had experienced the assassination at the Lin High State Gymnasium. His poor woman, his fugitive brother, told him with bloody facts that Macklin was the most insidious, cunning, and vicious mastermind in the Federation. A mastermind who had deceived everyone in the world. Just like the conversation with Inspector Shao outside the district procurator's office, Sulu only believed in his own principles now. He believed that Macklin was evil, and this old man who was deeply respected by the people was evil. On the news, Senator Macklin's speech had ended, and the reporters were applauding sincerely. Sulu felt unusually depressed and gloomy. He turned off the TV, walked into the bathroom and took a cold shower. Under the cold water, he lowered his head and cursed softly. The water was as cold as snowflakes floating down in June. The terrorist attack on the concert last night was indeed shocking. But the citizens of the Federation who saw those images couldn't help but feel sad and angry. However, it was an incident that happened in the 4 provinces of S2. The people living in S1 might feel sad because of it, but this emotion shouldn't last long. After a while they might even forget. The most prosperous city in the Federation, Harbor City, was a giant cold forest addicted to wealth and technology. It was good at forgetting and good at continuing its life after sighing. Pier 17 was not a pier, but Harbor City's most high-end leisure area. All kinds of bars and restaurants were quietly hidden within the complex streets and alleys. The news that was repeatedly playing on the news was no longer able to attract the attention of the diners. Only Sulu was still looking at the holographic screen above his head with narrowed eyes. He was eating with Bai Yulan. Opposite them were 2 men. One was Zhou Yu, and the other was a slightly plump, somewhat dignified middle-aged man. The middle-aged man looked coldly at Sulu, and after a moment said rudely, "Young man, is there something wrong with your brain? Why did you suddenly come to Harbor City?" Zhou Yu smiled bitterly and glanced at Sulu. Currently, the Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department were competing to develop the new generation of the Federation's MX mecha. Zhou Yu had always played the role of a middleman, responsible for transferring Sulu's core data back to the engineering department. He also did not understand why Sulu would suddenly come to Harbor City and request to meet with a powerful person in the engineering department. Hearing this rudeness, Sulu retracted his gaze and looked at the official from the Nutshell Engineering Department. He lowered his head and said, "It's clearly stated in the agreement that I can follow the progress of the mecha research at any time." The middle-aged man was a senior manager of the Nutshell Engineering Department. Not within the company, even within the Federation, he could be considered an extremely respected figure. He looked at Sulu and could not help but laugh mockingly. What a naive child. Then the man said coldly, "But it's good that you're here. According to the information we received, the Academy of Science has a bit more core data model than us. How do you explain that? Also, when are you going to give me the function formula? Since you're here today, you should settle this matter first." This kind of condescending tone was only natural in the eyes of this person. The young man sitting opposite him was only a level 3 technical supervisor. If he had not been so lucky as to follow Professor Shen, how could such a small fry be involved in the Federation's revolutionary new mecha research? As for the cooperation agreement, this senior manager did not believe it at all. In his opinion, a small fry like Sulu did not have the qualifications to talk to the Tai family, or to be more precise, talk to him about any kind of deal. Sulu quietly looked at this slightly plump senior manager. Suddenly, he turned his head and said to Zhou, "He doesn't know who I am?" Zhou lowered his head and gave a bitter laugh. The senior manager who had come to meet Sulu today had the surname Hao. He held an extremely important position in the engineering department. Manager Hao, who knew the inside story, obviously knew that this young man had played an important role in this matter. However, he felt that in front of him, in the Tai family, in the Shell Motor Corporation engineering department, this young man should have the self-awareness to hand over everything and not try to bargain. To be more precise, Manager Hao felt that Sulu should be hugging his leg and begging him to use the data. Sulu lowered his head and said, "I want a mecha." The senior manager seemed to have heard something unbelievable. The corners of his lips curled up slightly, revealing a mocking smile. He maintained his silence and could not be bothered with Sulu. He gently stirred his coffee cup. Sulu waited for a while, then dialed a number. He said to the person on the other end of the line, "I'm currently talking to a manager with the surname Hao. It's not a very pleasant conversation. Your request is a bit too high. I might not be able to satisfy you. I'm not in a good mood today," Sulu said softly into the phone. "If we can't reach an agreement, then forget it." He hung up the phone, stood up and prepared to leave. Zhou had gradually gotten a better understanding of Sulu's personality after interacting with him for the past few days. He knew that this young squatter had a different temperament from everyone in the Federation. What nutshell mobility company? What Tai family? What Tai family? What nutshell mobility company? What Tai family? Perhaps they could make him feel some fear, but if he was truly pushed to the edge, he would really do anything. Manager Hao stared in disbelief at Sulu, who was preparing to leave. He had not expected this young man's reaction to be so big. He stared coldly at Sulu, lowered his head, and said calmly, "Don't forget Professor Shen's name. In the entire Federation, under the pressure of Dean Lin, the only ones who can continue to help you are us." Sulu had originally planned to pretend that he did not hear this person speak, but when he heard his teacher's name, he stopped his thoughts of turning and leaving. He stared at Manager Hao's plump face like he was staring at a flower that was about to bloom. Manager Hao smiled and said, "Calm down a little, young man. There's no good in being too easily angered." Right at this moment, the phone in Sulu's hand rang. After the call was connected, the voice on the other end was silent for a moment before saying, "I will get someone to prepare a mecha, but at most it will be an M50 or less." Sulu stared at Manager Hao's face and said into the phone, "Sure. But I don't want to talk to this piece of trash surnamed Hao. If Zhou position on your side is not high enough, you can get someone else to come." When Manager Hao heard the word piece of trash, he abruptly raised his head, slammed the table angrily and stood up. He extended a finger to point at Sulu's nose and scolded, "You little." He only had time to say the word little. Sulu was an easily angered young man, but he had always been very angry today. Bai Yulan, who had been standing silently beside him all this time, had been carefully observing his reactions. She knew that if this fellow vented his anger, it would be a very scary thing. So when Manager Hao stood up, she silently took a step forward and stood in front of Sulu, one hand gripping Manager Hao's finger. With a crisp crack, the finger broke. Chapter 212. Why was it so brittle? Buried in the snow, frozen in the ice, dried in the wind, like a carrot with a beautiful heart. With a snap it broke without a trace. Even the sound was crisp. Bai Yulan lowered her head and twisted her finger. Manager Hao's angry finger was deformed with a snap, just like the plate of crispy cucumber on the dining table. His chubby face immediately paled. The sharp pain from his bent fingers reached Supervisor Hao's brain. He did not have time to consider why the two young people sitting in front of him would be so reckless, so daring, and so vicious. He only had time to open his mouth like a child and reveal his smoke-stained teeth. He was prepared to turn the pain into a scream of pain. Bai Yulan kept her head down and stood gently beside Su Lu. Her left hand had already picked up a piece of bread from the table and brought it to Manager Hao's mouth at some point. She coldly stuffed it in, turning the scream he hadn't yet let out into a muffled grunt. Manager Hao's mouth was stuffed with bread. Beads of sweat flowed down his face. His pupils constricted and his body collapsed. He held his hand in pain and leaned on the sofa, his body curling up in pain. Zhou Yu abruptly stood up and stared at the delicate man in disbelief. He didn't know the identity of the delicate man besides Su Lu, but he really didn't expect that the other party would be so ruthless just because of a small disagreement. Bai Yulan didn't even look at Zhou Yu. She kept her head down and took a step back. She retreated behind Su Lu, as if nothing had happened. She was ladylike and calm. Su Li's contact with the Nutshell Engineering Department was, of course, very careful in order to hide it from the eyes of many people in the Federation. The two parties arranged to meet in the depths of an inconspicuous restaurant at Pier 17. The previous scene didn't alarm the other diners. He held the phone in his right hand and looked at the chubby manager on the sofa. He then raised his head to look at Zhou Yu and shook his head. Zhou Yu's brows furrowed as he looked at Bai Magnolia. He wondered where Su Lu had found such a person. She looked like a girl, but when she fought she was so direct and ruthless. I'll send Supervisor Hao to the hospital. Zhou Yu looked at Su Lu and sighed. I don't know what's wrong with you today. Why is your temper so bad? Su Lu did not expect Secretary Bai to publish the book before him. Furthermore, she broke the other party's finger. If it was in the past, he would definitely not agree with this. However, for some reason, he was only startled today and did not express any opinion. He nodded at Zhou Yu and walked out of the restaurant with the white magnolia. He spoke into the phone. Manager Hao needs to go to the hospital and can't talk to me. You should choose someone else to talk to me. My request is still the same. Zhou Yu helped Supervisor Hao stand up. He smiled bitterly and wanted to say a few words of comfort, but he didn't know what to say. By this time, Supervisor Hao had adapted to the pain of his broken finger. His face was pale as he spat out the bread in his mouth with his tongue. He was battered and exhausted, but he bitterly cursed, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. Zhou Yu was silent for a few seconds before reminding him, Su Lu has been speaking directly with Secretary Shan. The previous call should have been made to Great Secretary Shan. This sentence did not reveal much information, but it was very important. When Supervisor Hao heard the words, Great Secretary Shan, he suddenly froze in place. He was silent for a long time, as though he had forgotten about his broken finger. He looked at the restaurant's exit with resentment. He knew that he had misunderstood the true meaning of today's meeting. He had completely misjudged the background of the third-level technical supervisor. However, how could he accept that the other party was so vicious? However, if the other party was someone who could directly negotiate with Great Secretary Shan, even if he was unwilling, he probably could not find a way to get revenge. Zhou Yu was also silently looking at the restaurant's exit. At the exit, Su Lu had already hung up the phone. He silently walked toward the sunny streets of Harbor City. Behind him, the vicious and delicate man was silently following him, pulling a black leather suitcase. In his impression, Su Lu had always been a quiet, calm, amiable and trustworthy young man. He had never been so intense and gloomy as he was today. What could have caused such a big change in his state of mind? Su Lu was in front, and Bai Yulan was behind him. Two young men and a heavy black suitcase walked in the Federation's most prosperous city. They were like two fellows carrying a huge treasure walking beside the salivating mouth of a giant shadow beast. Perhaps it was the terrorist attack at last night's concert, or perhaps it was the touching scene of the senator's speech on the news, which made Su Li's mood extremely bad. Otherwise, he would not have acted so tough in the restaurant earlier. In fact, since he was young, he had always been a very easygoing person. On the surface, his personality was very gentle. Or perhaps it was the two insufferably arrogant men's backs when the high-speed train came to an emergency stop last night. That arrogant back view that treated all the rules of the world as trash had touched some corner of his heart? Sulu did not know that the most flashy and arrogant leader of the 7 big families in the Federation had once given him a complex evaluation that he was too young and not frivolous. In fact, he was still a young man in his 20s. How could his temperament not be filled with the scent of youthful hormones? However, in the past, due to objective or subjective reasons, Sulu's frivolous temperament was hidden extremely well. It was transformed into an external display of stubbornness and stubbornness. Now, this temperament was gradually revealed due to his anger. Unfortunately, before he could show anything, the usually silent Bai Yulan made a move first. Sulu looked back at Bai Yulan, smiled and said, "Let's go for a drink?" Not far in front of the two of them, there was a tavern emitting the smell of oak. Zhang Xiaohua, the big boss of Nank, could easily find out that Sulu had left the capital special district and was heading to the port city. He could find out which train he had taken and which carriage he had taken. He did not know if the Federal Academy of Science and the Li family had relaxed their surveillance of him, but Sulu was a very careful person. Looking at the 30-year-old amber wine gently swirling in his glass, Sulu thought of the ancient song called 27 Days of Wine. Naturally, he thought of Child Sure, who loved to sing this song with tears streaming down his face. He raised his glass to the same level as his eyebrows and stared blankly at the wine in his glass. Through the wine, he noticed the 2 drinkers in the dark corner of the tavern entrance. The 2 drinkers looked very normal, but Sulu felt that there was something wrong. If they were spies like Shi Qinghai, who had received a systematic and cruel education, they would definitely be able to find loopholes in the many details surrounding these 2 drinkers. However, Sulu did not have this ability. He only had a natural sense for danger, and after escaping from the Donglin district, he was always cautious at every moment. He did not know if they were government agents or peripheral military personnel from the engineering department. If they were professionals sent by the Li family, then this matter was somewhat troublesome. Sulu stared blankly at the wine in his glass. This trip to the port city was originally just to see if Secretary Shen was sincere in fulfilling the agreement. At the same time, he also thought about the development of the new generation of MX Mecha. He wanted to see the progress of the engineering department and see if he needed to take the risk to provide those solutions. He brought Secretary Bai here because Secretary Bai had personally operated this new type of mecha before. If he could have a private space to face the new type of mecha, then Secretary Bai would be equivalent to his test pilot. The Li family and the Academy of Science would probably not believe that he had the core data. Since Secretary Shen trusted the engineering department, then the Tai family must have a great influence on the upper management of the Nutshell engineering department. There would not be a problem of secrets being leaked. However, if the eldest young master of the Li family knew that he had come to the port city, would he think more? At the very least, he could not let the other party see that he was in contact with the Nutshell engineering department. Sulu put down his wine glass. Just as he was about to stand up, he realized that Bai Magnolia, who had been silently drinking orange juice on his left, had once again stood up before him. Bai Magnolia put the ice in her mouth. Without saying anything, she walked towards the back of the pub. The 2 people in the shadows at the entrance had already planned for this situation. One of them pretended to be drunk and followed her to the back of the pub. No matter how prosperous the city, no matter how modern the era was, the back of the pub was always quiet, messy, and dirty. There were rats in the trash bins, pee stains under the paint peeling off the walls, and traces of vomiting last night. Bai Magnolia did not smoke and did not drink today. Naturally, she would not vomit in the back alley. She just closed her eyes, unzipped her pants and happily peed. The pub patron also came to the back alley and started to pee. He did not need to follow them, but he was worried that the 2 targets would split up. Therefore, to be careful, he did not want to let the target out of his sight. There are so many people drinking at noon in the port city? Bai Magnolia trembled and silently walked towards the pub patron. She said softly, "You did not pee. It's none of your fucking business." The pub patron realized that there was something wrong, but he still acted very calmly and fiercely. With a puff, the pub patron realized that the handsome man beside him had opened his mouth and spat something sharp towards his face. As a professional, he certainly knew that it was not saliva. Naturally, he associated it with some insidious hidden weapons in the rumors and quickly retreated. His retreat was not as fast as Bai Magnolia's advance. The pub patron groaned and touched his waist with his right hand, while the two fingers of his left hand fiercely pierced into By Magnolia's expressionless eyes. However, he lost his balance at this time because By Magnolia had lowered his head and stepped forward, coincidentally stepping on his shoelaces. With the two fingers in the air, By Magnolia's left hand turned into a knife and smoothly chopped towards the pub patron's neck. There was no wind, but it was extremely cold. The pub patron did not have time to take out his gun. He blocked it with his arm and quickly stepped back with his left foot, stepping on the wet ground of the back alley to keep his balance. However, he immediately felt that the other side of his neck was cold. By Magnolia loosened his right hand. He did not know when there was a delicate knife in his right hand. At this time, the delicate knife had been quietly inserted into the pub patron's neck, like a branch inserted into the soil. He then loosened the shoelaces of his right foot and reached out to grab the pub patron's tie, not letting the still twitching body fall down. By Magnolia opened the garbage bin, stuffed the pub patron into it and carefully pulled out the knife. Almost at the same time, he quickly closed the lid of the garbage bin. Through the metal lid, the sound of rain spraying faintly sounded in the garbage bin. By Magnolia wiped the knife clean and walked into the pub with a calm face. Chapter 213. The glass of amber liquor was still on the black and white stone table. The wine was fermented and distilled, mixed with years of time in the cellar. It gradually permeated into people's noses. Although it was not as clear as the diluted essence sprayed from the oak barrel outside the pub, it was very infectious, as if it had a life of its own. Harbor City was a city that was greedy for enjoyment. These days were the Federation's summer holidays. Therefore, although it was still noon, there were already several tables of guests in the dark pub. Sulu, who was sitting at the bar, was not conspicuous. He stared at the liquor in the glass in a daze, thinking about the changes in his mood from last night to today. He was silent for a while. Bai Yulan came back alone and sat beside him. She silently began to sip the orange juice that was about to reach the bottom. The ice cubes under the fancy straw rolled in the orange juice, looking very cute. The drinker did not come back. Sulu guessed what had happened. He did not expect that Secretary Bai would take the initiative to work for him. He thought of the tea in the luxurious room and the work of making the bed. He was a little confused for a moment. 20 million was indeed a lot of money, but it was not a loss to buy such a handsome man who was almost omnipotent to work for him. For a moment, he forgot that Li Xiaotong had invested 30 million yuan in him, which was already a very bold and very risky investment. However, he had casually given 20 million yuan to Bai Magnolia, which made the hidden meaning behind it even more obvious. Sulu glanced at Bai Magnolia. Bai Magnolia lowered her voice and said slowly, "I don't do anything illegal." That person fainted. Sulu smiled bitterly. It wasn't because of Bai Yulan's decision, but because someone was keeping an eye on him. It meant that the person who planned everything out didn't forget about him, just because of Secretary Shun's phone call and the data transfer. This was a very troublesome thing. Even if he could quietly enter the Nutshell Engineering Department later, this matter could not be hidden from many people in the Federation. The straw made a cute gurgling sound. Bai Magnolia smiled and asked the bartender for another glass. Sulu looked at the silent phone beside the glass. The conditions he had proposed to the Tai family were indeed a little too much in the eyes of the average person, and could even be called wishful thinking. However, since he had already decided to help the engineering department develop the MX Mecha as quickly as possible, he had to get some benefits he urgently needed. He was waiting for Secretary Shun's final decision. A Federation military mecha was something he needed, and before tonight, he had to enter the heavily guarded engineering department. The waiting process was a little boring. Sulu tilted his head and looked at Bai Magnolia's delicate features with great interest. He suddenly said, "I remember you said that you like to enjoy life, and that you have a few bottles of Wenjun No. 3 at home." Wenjun brandy was one of the most famous spirits in the Federation. It was produced in Region S3's Ganzhou Hill district, named after the scientist in the five-man team who liked to drink. The brand was authorized and protected by the HTD Bureau of the Federation. Among them, the No. 3 bottles were all treasures that had been in the cellar for more than 30 years. They had a soft taste, a rich aroma, and were surprisingly expensive. Brandy, I like to drink apple-flavored. By Magnolia narrowed her eyes and looked at the glass of orange juice in her hand. She said, "The real best is still the compound wheat wine from the Han estate. It's cleaner." Sulu thought that if Shi Qinghai was here, he would have a lot in common with this delicate man. Speaking of which, Shi Qinghai had a pair of peach blossom eyes and handsome features, but he was very masculine. Secretary Bai's features, on the other hand, didn't have any seductive features. They were just quiet and gentle and truly feminine. "Why don't you have a drink?" Sulu raised the glass in his hand and suggested, "It tastes good. It's real wine." "I never drink during work hours," replied Bai Magnolia softly. Bai Yulan replied softly. She lowered her eyes slightly and glanced over from the corner of her eyes. She noticed that the drinker at the entrance of the pub seemed to have noticed something strange. The speed at which he turned the square cup in his hand was faster than before. Small details revealed a person's true emotions. The speed at which one spun the glass often represented the degree of anxiety in one's heart. "How much longer do we have to wait?" asked Bai Magnolia softly. Sulu looked at the silent phone on the table. After a moment of silence, he shook his head. If Secretary Shin didn't call again, things would take a different direction. Bai Magnolia glanced at the side of his face. Looking at this young technical director's ordinary face, she didn't say anything else. In the private meeting in the restaurant earlier, the information revealed in those few words had already allowed Bai Magnolia to understand many things. Even though Sulu still hadn't told her clearly, she knew. This 20 million Federation dollars was really not easy to earn. This matter seemed to involve the development of the new generation of the Federation mecha, the MX mecha. As the former combat director of Whitewater Company's Team 7, Bai Magnolia had personally participated in the secret experiment conducted in the Bermuda Triangle Star region last autumn. Of course, she knew what this meant. Bai Magnolia glanced at Su Li's side profile again. She thought to herself that this time she had really played it big. All the private jobs she had taken on in her life added up together weren't this big. However, this delicate man had always been an extremely professional person. Since he had accepted the huge sum of 20 million Federation dollars, he would definitely complete this private job. Thus, he had killed people in the alleyway to establish his authority, using this sort of cruel bloodshed to temporarily intimidate those who were tailing Sulu. Bai Magnolia only did things. She wouldn't explain anything to Sulu. As the Federation's most elite professional soldier, he had left the military for many years, often carrying out shady missions for the government. He didn't have much of a concept of good and evil. As for the Federation's #1 organization, the glory of the Charter, he also had enough knowledge and small tricks to deceive the public. The precision and density of the Federation's electronic surveillance network was something that few people knew better than him, a mercenary soldier of the Federation. This delicate man wouldn't do anything illegal for money, but if there was enough money, killing people for Sulu would be as natural as serving Sulu tea and food. The phone finally rang again. The sound wasn't loud, but it pulled Sulu and Bai Magnolia out of their respective thoughts. Sulu picked up the phone and listened for a few words. His expression gradually calmed down, and there was a smile in his slightly squinted eyes. However, that smile was a habit, and not a joy that came from the heart. "Let's go." Sulu took out a $100 bill and put it on the table. He smiled at the bartender and greeted him. Then he stood up. Seeing that the target had the intention to leave, the stalker who was pretending to be drunk at the entrance of the bar didn't know what to do. His companions had followed the man who looked like a woman to the back alley, but the target had returned, but his companions hadn't. A strong sense of foreboding emerged in his heart, but he couldn't give up on following. Sulu walked towards the door. Bai Magnolia, as usual, took half a step back and leaned a little to the left. When they walked out of the bar, they would pass by the drunkard who was pretending to be drunk. At that moment, Bai Magnolia prepared 3 methods to make this person lie on the table forever. This way he wouldn't be able to follow her, and it wouldn't attract attention. However, just as Bai Yulan's fingers danced in her sleeves, Sulu took a step to the left. When she walked past the tracker who was pretending to be drunk, she seemed to have lost her balance and her left hand gently stroked the tracker's back. The drunkard's body twitched slightly, and then he fell weakly on the table. At this time there was no need to pretend. He was unconscious and he was truly a drunkard. Sulu and By Magnolia didn't stay for a moment. They directly walked out of the bar. By Magnolia, who was walking behind them, slowly raised her head. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she looked at Suli's back with complex emotions. Just a moment ago, By Magnolia's eyes were extremely sharp. The moment Suli's hand touched the drunkard's back, a faint blue arc of electricity drilled out of Suli's sleeve. It was like a snake flashing with electric light. Except for the high-strength stun batons used by the military special forces, there were no close-range weapons that could silently knock a person out. Moreover, there wasn't the slightest burnt smell in the air, and there weren't any tears in the back of the drunkard's clothes. By Magnolia looked at Sulu with complex emotions. On one hand, she thought that this young technical director whom she worked so hard for had an extraordinary background. On the other hand, she was a little depressed. If she had known that Sulu had such a good thing in his hands, the person in the back alley wouldn't have died, according to the instructions of the person on the phone. After Sulu and By Magnolia left Pier Number 17, they rented a car and drove directly to the Bulan district of Harbor City. Then they rented a boat at the Riverside Stone Bridge and followed the Sangu Creek downstream. When they were about to reach the Sangu area, they abandoned the boat and went ashore. By Magnolia carried the heavy black box and followed behind Sulu. Suddenly, she asked, "Is the person trustworthy?" "I know the person on the phone," Sulu replied. Next to a retro-style building with cornices, the two people finally saw the person who came to pick them up. Sulu looked at the big man in a black suit, hung up the phone, and said with a smile, "You cooperated again." Xuan, the director of the Blackhawk Company, said with a wry smile, "Secretary Shen used to be my direct superior. I happen to be in Harbor City today. If I don't do this, who will?" Half a year ago in Linhai State, it was this retired soldier who led 3 helicopters and rescued Sulu and Shi Qinghai from the Federation's pursuit. "What I want is long-term access." Sulu looked at him and said seriously, "There are still 5 months before the election. I will come to Harbor City often. Temporary access to the engineering department is too troublesome." Xuan was silent for a moment and said, "This is too difficult. It is even more difficult than making a mecha. You should know that we have a certain amount of influence in the engineering department, but an existence like the Nutshell Company is not something that anyone can control alone." "I believe you." Sulu shook hands with him and said sincerely. By Magnolia had been silently following behind Sulu. She had already recognized Xuan identity. After all, the Blackhawk Company was also one of the 3 major security companies in the Federation. She had fought side by side with the people of Blackhawk, so of course she knew Xuan. But after hearing Suli's words, By Magnolia suddenly lowered her head and smiled. It seemed that the person she was working for was not someone who only knew how to be stubborn and pedantic. She was gradually showing signs of cunning. This was good. This was not easy to die. Chapter 214. Behind every successful man, there would always be a few extremely outstanding secretaries. As the saying went, "You go to the Sea of Flowers, I go to the Sea of Fire. You go to the Parliament Mountain, I go to the Mountain of Knives. You go to the High and Mighty, I will be the scapegoat, I will do the dirty things, I will be the one to pull those stupid fingers, I will be the one to kill those annoying people, and I can't let you know." This was the function of a secretary. Today, Sulu was still 420 light-years away from success, but he already had a secretary by his side called Bai Yulan. She was submissive but extremely useful. For a successful person like Li Xiuzhu, the young master of the Li family, the vice president of the Sanlin United Bank, he would naturally have many secretaries. Secretary Liu was the one with the highest rank and the most trusted. Secretary Liu, who was not by Li Xiuzhu's side, was an important figure in the Federation's financial world. He was a high-ranking officer in the company and had an enviable life. Today was still the summer holiday. He was on vacation with his beautiful wife and obedient daughter in the Demonstration Ecological Park, in the outskirts of the capital. With a clear pond in front and a happy family in the garden behind, Secretary Liu stole half a day of leisure. He covered his face with a straw hat to block the rays of sunlight that leaked in through the bamboo canopy. The fishing rod in front of him bobbed up and down quietly on the surface of the water. He didn't care at all about the fish stealing food. A phone call disturbed his peace. Secretary Lu took off his straw hat and quietly listened to the report on the other end of the phone. His expression gradually became serious. That technical supervisor called Su Lu had gone to Hong Kong. The two subordinates in charge of tracking and surveillance had suddenly lost contact. They didn't know where that fellow had gone. Secretary Lu was silent for a moment. Then he made a few more calls and arranged some things. Many days had passed since the incident at the Husk Institute's laboratory. Everyone believed that no one else would be able to know the data from the laboratory. The young master of the Li family had almost forgotten about Su Lu, but he hadn't. This was because he had discovered that Su Lu and the seventh young master had been getting closer recently. It was said that the Nutshell Engineering Department was also speeding up the development of new mecha. Now that Su Lu was going to Harbor City, what did it mean? Secretary Lu's expression was somewhat dignified, but his heart was not as solemn as he appeared to be. In his opinion, Su Lu followed Professor Shen, and perhaps he had some knowledge in the field of quantum measurable dynamics, which was why he was valued by the Nutshell Engineering Department. However, this should not affect the overall situation. The two subordinates who had lost contact with him were too far below Secretary Lu's level, so he was not worried about them. He was just wondering if this was a warning from the Tai family, the Ministry of National Defense, or the Nutshell Engineering Department. After pondering for a moment, Secretary Lu decided to leave this matter to him. He was not an ordinary secretary. No matter how big or small the matter was, he had to leave it to Li Xiuzhu to handle. He had his own authority. Most importantly, he knew that young Master Li had already boarded the family's private spaceship and was rushing to District S2 to comfort the innocent idol who had been affected by the terrorist attack. Secretary Lu knew how much the young master valued the person who had been chosen by the family, so he did not want this kind of bad news to disturb the young master's extremely angry mood. He made a phone call and gave some important instructions to his subordinates in Harbor City. Secretary Lu lay back on the bamboo chair and covered his straw hat. He listened to the laughter of his family behind him, and listened to the faint sound of the fish stealing food in front of him. A satisfied smile appeared on his face, and he fell into a deep sleep. Harbor City was a huge city. Its economy was extremely developed. Especially on the large plain towards the south of the city, there were countless factory buildings. These buildings were spread out neatly on the land, and they occupied a large area. Although the Federation's heavy manufacturing industry had been gradually moved to District S2 many years ago, the foundation of the high-precision manufacturing industry was still in Jingzhou, in Harbor City. An inconspicuous truck left the highway and drove directly towards an industrial park. The industrial park did not have a strict gate, and there was no eye-catching name. There was only a row of large words cast on a green hill in the distance. The hill was very far away, and the row of large words was as high as a 20-story building. All of them were cast from high-strength alloys. The cold metallic luster revealed a sense of grandeur of a small world. Where there is metal, there will be fruit shells. The truck followed the spacious passage and drove at high speed in the industrial park. A plane could be faintly seen landing in the distance. That was the industrial airport of the Shell Motor Company. From the airport to the Federation's largest spaceport, Harbor City Spaceport, there was a complete transportation network formed by a dedicated road and a double-track high-speed railway. Countless resources and technical personnel from all over the Federation gathered in this huge industrial park, in the southern suburbs of Harbor City, through this convenient transportation. Su Lu sat in the back of the truck. He lifted the dust-proof cloth covering the window and silently looked at the huge factory building in front of him from time to time. The heavy and huge mechanical equipment in front of him could not help but be a little lost. He was one of the employees of the Shell Motor Company. It was just that in the past, he dealt with data in the Research Institute, and then he spent his days in the Whitewater Company. Today was actually the first time he had truly entered the manufacturing department of the Shell Motor Company. Only by seeing this industrial park with his own eyes could he truly feel the position of the Shell Motor Company in the Federation, and the huge power of this motor company. The automobile manufacturing business was all moved to District S2 13 constitutional calendars ago. But later, because of the increase in the cost of interplanetary travel, A part of the automobile manufacturing business was moved back to District S1. In the southwest corner is the Shell Aerospace Manufacturing Group, also known as the First Flight Bureau of the Federation. It is mainly used to manufacture aircrafts in the atmosphere. The spaceship manufacturing factory is not in Harbor City, but in Nevada. If you include the assembly base on Moon 1, the total area is slightly larger than the industrial park here in Harbor City. The Civilian Goods Manufacturing Company, which is often referred to as the Shell Motor Company, is concentrated in South Dakota. The direction of business in Harbor City is mainly cars and airplanes. About 30% of the Federation's self-made equipment is assembled in this industrial park. Jingzhou's GDP last year exceeded $5 trillion Federation dollars, ranking first among all the state-level administrative regions in the Federation, and Harbor City accounted for a share of $3.4 trillion. Of this $3.4 trillion, the Shell Motor Company provided 27% of it, which is the industrial park you see now. Bai Yulan softly played the role of a secretary. To be precise, she was originally Su Li's secretary. The Mecha Manufacturing Department is a top secret of the Federation. No one knows that it is also hidden in this industrial park. Bai Yulan softly said, but in fact, the Federation's secrecy measures have always been a bit of self-deception. Since the Shell Motor Company is here, the mecha will naturally be here as well. Understood. Sulu nodded, expressing his gratitude to Bai Yulan for her explanation. During their tour, the truck drove away from the main area of the industrial park and drove inconspicuously towards an ordinary warehouse. When the truck drove into the warehouse, the rusty door immediately closed. A building that looked like an underground parking lot appeared in front of them, but the further down they went, the more unusual it felt. This underground parking lot had too many parking spaces and was too deep, but there were too few parked cars. The truck stopped and Sulu and Bai Yulan walked out, dragging a heavy black leather case. Xuan, who was disguised as the truck driver, said to the two, "This is as far as I can go. Inside is a top secret of the Federation. I can't go in." Sulu nodded and watched the truck leave. Entering the industrial park from the port city and arriving at the periphery of the engineering department seemed simple, but if it weren't for Xuan's arrangements, he and Bai Yulan would have been stopped in the middle of the industrial park or shot to death by automatic firearms. There was no one in the dark underground parking lot. Sulu and Bai Yulan were like two tourists who had been dropped off on a desert road. In this empty underground space, they looked lonely and helpless. Right at this moment, the sound of a freight elevator rang out beside them. After the elevator door opened, two people appeared. Sulu walked in and extended his hand to shake Zhou Yu's hand. Then, he noticed the person behind Zhou Yu who looked like an official. He looked familiar, but it was fine as long as he wasn't that insincere severed finger, Supervisor Hao. "I'm Jose. We met during the spring recruitment." The freight elevator started to descend at high speed. The official in the elevator silently looked at Sulu for a long time before he opened his mouth and said, "We haven't seen each other for a few months. I didn't expect that we would meet again under such circumstances. Your authority in the research institute has been stripped. As a third-level technical supervisor of the Whitewater Company, you can't enter the core area of the engineering department. Your request not only violated the internal regulations of the Shell Motor Company, but also violated the laws of the Federation." Sulu recognized the senior supervisor of the Shell Motor Company. During the spring recruitment exam, it was this official who had interviewed him. Although the two didn't say much, Sulu knew that the other party had always been kind to him. Therefore, he didn't mind the tone of the other party, but he didn't want to let the other party continue. "I don't want temporary authority. I want long-term authority." He looked into Jose's eyes and said seriously, "Impossible. Although the core data you provided is important, it's not enough for an important place like the engineering department to open its doors for you," said Jose. "No one knows how far the Empire's new mecha research has progressed, so the Federation needs time," said Sula calmly with his head lowered. "The Federal Academy of Science is already ahead of the engineering department, so you also need time. I can assure you that the Federal Academy of Science has no way to solve the problem of the electron jets. I can help you solve this problem in the shortest amount of time. So the Federation needs me. And you need me even more." The high-speed descent of the elevator gave first-timers a sense of dizziness. However, Suli's calm speech was so clear and direct that it made Jose and Zhouyu, the HR manager of the engineering department, feel slightly dizzy. Sulu finally said, "My conditions remain the same. Other than what I said before, I want long-term authority to enter the engineering department and full control of the MX Mecha." The elevator doors opened.